On the 4th of March 2011, a man who had told the BBC 8 years later that he had stopped contacting Jeffrey Epstein in December 2010 sent Jeffrey Epstein an email. He used the handle The Duke. Epstein had just forwarded him a message. A newspaper was working on a story. A woman named Virginia Giuffre was coming forward with her allegations. The Duke wrote back, "What? I don't know any of this. How are you responding?" Epstein replied that he had asked Ghislaine's lawyers to send a letter. Then he added, "I'm not sure how to respond. The only person she didn't have sex with was Elvis." The Duke replied, "Please make sure that every statement or legal letter states clearly that I am not involved and that I knew and know nothing about any of these allegations. I can't take any more of this my end." Then he forwarded the same email to Maxwell directly. He wrote, "Hey there, what's all this? I don't know anything about this. You must say so, please. This has nothing to do with me. I can't take any more of this." 2 days later, Epstein sent the Duke a message he labeled, "Feel free to pass this to your press people." It read, "You okay? These stories are complete and utter fantasy. I don't know and have never met Al Gore. Clinton was never on the island. The telephone book is not mine. It was stolen by my houseman who is currently in prison for doing so. That exchange sat in a file for 14 years. When it was released, in 2025, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor had already settled a civil lawsuit for £12 million, had already been stripped of his titles, and had already been photographed in a location matching Epstein's New York mansion, kneeling on all fours over an unidentified woman lying on the floor. Her face was redacted, his was not. He was looking directly into the camera. There was a second photograph. It was taken at Sandringham, the British royal family's private estate in Norfolk. In it, a younger Andrew is lying across the laps of 5 women, their faces blacked out, in black tie attire. Ghislaine Maxwell stands behind him, looking down, smiling. He brought her to Sandringham. The man who told the world in November 2019 that he barely knew Epstein, that he had only stayed at his house once, as a convenient place to break off the friendship in person, had been emailing him, as the Duke, in March 2011. Had been writing, "Please make sure every statement says, I am not involved." Had been writing, "I can't take any more of this." Had been photographed in Epstein's Manhattan townhouse. Had brought Ghislaine Maxwell to Sandringham. These were the things the public learned from the files. They were not the whole of what the files contained. There was the August 2001 email from Balmoral, sent from an account called The Invisible Man, 5 months after Virginia Giuffre alleged the first assault in London. "Have you found me some new inappropriate friends?" Maxwell replied that she had only found appropriate friends. The Invisible Man wrote back, distraught. There was the 2002 email about Peru, in which Maxwell offered to arrange some 2-legged sightseeing with companions described as friendly and discreet and fun, and noted, he does not want to read about any trip in the papers describing whom or what he saw. There was the Buckingham Palace dinner invitation, found in Epstein's files. He had been to the palace. There was the J.P. Morgan Internal Risk Assessment of 2019, filed to a New York court in 2023, which described Epstein as maintaining a particularly close relationship with Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, and Lord Peter Mandelson, a senior member of the British government. 4 days after Andrew was arrested on his 66th birthday on suspicion of misconduct in public office, Peter Mandelson, the former British ambassador to the United States, the former cabinet minister, who had described Epstein in a 2003 birthday tribute as "my best pal," was also arrested. Same charge, same allegation, that both men may have passed confidential government information to the same convicted sex offender. 2 of the most prominent figures in British public life, arrested within 4 days of each other. The public knew about Andrew. What the public did not fully know was the size of the circle he was operating in, and the depth of the access he was providing, and the specific content of the files that the Department of Justice had been releasing in tranches across 2025 and into 2026, each tranche adding a new dimension to the picture of a man whose public account of himself had been organized, from the BBC interview onward, around the minimum possible acknowledgement of the maximum possible involvement. Andrew appears in the Epstein files 173 times. He is the most frequently named British figure in 23,000 documents. The emails, The photographs, the travel logs, the legal notes, the press clippings accumulated over decades. They tell a story considerably darker and considerably more extensive than the story the public was given. And the story the public was given was already one of the most damaging royal scandals since the abdication. What the files actually contain, assembled from the full extent of what has been released and what the ongoing investigations have established, is what this account examines. Not the public version, the file version. They are not the same story. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. On the 7th of October 2010, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, then Prince Andrew and Duke of York, the United Kingdom's special representative for international trade and investment, sent Jeffrey Epstein an email. The email contained details of his upcoming official trips as trade envoy to Singapore, Vietnam, Shenzhen in China, and Hong Kong. The details were confidential in the specific sense that the official guidance governing the trade envoy role imposed on its holder a duty of strict confidentiality over sensitive commercial and political information obtained in the course of the duties, and the information Andrew was forwarding to a private individual who held no government position and no security clearance was the information that the official guidance required to be treated with the duty of confidentiality that the role's terms imposed. That email was the first of the documented sequence. The second came 54 days later, on the 30th of November 2010. Andrew's then special assistant, a man named Amit Patel, sent his employer the visit reports from the Southeast Asia trips, official documents summarizing the outcomes and assessments of the Singapore, Vietnam, Hong Kong, and Shenzhen visits. The email from Patel to Andrew was time-stamped. The email from Andrew to Epstein forwarding those documents was also time-stamped. The gap between the two timestamps was 5 minutes. Patel sent the confidential visit reports to his employer at a specific time. 5 minutes later, those reports were in Jeffrey Epstein's inbox. 5 minutes. The forwarding took 5 minutes. The third email came on Christmas Eve of 2010. The United Kingdom had soldiers fighting and dying in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. British troops had been in Helmand since 2006. The campaign had cost hundreds of British lives, and was, by Christmas of 2010, one of the most sensitive ongoing military and political commitments the British government was managing. Alongside the military campaign, reconstruction efforts were being coordinated through the specific channels that the trade envoy role was designed to engage with. Andrew, as the trade envoy, had been briefed on investment opportunities connected to that reconstruction. The briefing was confidential. On the evening of the 24th of December 2010, he forwarded a document he called a confidential brief to Jeffrey Epstein, and told Epstein he would be very interested in your comments, views, or ideas as to whom I could also usefully show this to attract some interest. He sent a confidential Afghan reconstruction briefing to a convicted sex offender on Christmas Eve. He asked the convicted sex offender whom else he should show it to. Andrew had told the BBC's Emily Maitlis in the Newsnight interview of November 2019 that he had last seen Epstein in early December 2010 in New York, in the visit during which he said he had ended the friendship. The email of Christmas Eve 2010 was dated 3 weeks after that claimed ending. The Southeast Asia visit reports were forwarded to Epstein in November, before the claimed ending. The trade envoy details were shared in October, before the claimed ending. The timeline that the Newsnight interview presented to the public, the timeline of a man who had maintained a friendship he now recognized as unwise and who had taken the first available opportunity to end it, was not the timeline that the emails documented. What the emails documented was different. They documented a man who was using the access that his government role provided to generate the specific variety of the useful that the government role's confidential material represented for the person he was sharing it with. And the person he was sharing it with was a man who had been convicted in 2008 of soliciting prostitution from a minor and who had spent the 13 months of his sentence and every month since his release in 2009 in the continued operation of the financial and social machinery that the conviction had not dismantled. The machinery ran on the specific fuel of the access that the people Epstein maintained in his network provided, and the access that Andrew was providing was the access of the British government's trade envoy to confidential commercial intelligence about 4 of the most commercially significant territories in the world, and to a sensitive military and reconstruction brief about an active British combat operation. In December 2009, a year before the Christmas Eve Helmand email, Andrew had sent Epstein a different message. He wrote that he had spent a weekend in Paris with an interesting American family bank who are after some help in the Middle East, a gap in their geographic coverage. Later that evening, Epstein replied, asking for more information about the bank and its principals. The exchange was the exchange of 2 people conducting a business conversation in the specific register of 2 people whose business relationship had established the specific understanding of what each party could provide to the other. And what Andrew was providing was the network of contacts and the commercial intelligence and the trade envoy's access that the role had generated. And what Epstein was providing was the specific hospitality and the specific social world and the specific variety of the useful that Epstein's network provided to the people whose access to it he was managing. The files in which these emails appeared had been assembled by the United States Department of Justice across the years of its investigation into Jeffrey Epstein, and had been released in tranches across 2025 and into 2026, under the legislative pressure that the House Oversight Committee and the Senate Judiciary Committee had been applying since Epstein's death in August 2019, and that had intensified in the first months of 2026, as the revelations each release produced had generated the public pressure that the public pressure of significant revelations generates when the revelations are significant enough to require the response of further disclosure rather than the management of the existing disclosure's coverage. The trade envoy emails were among the revelations of the February 2026 release, and their reception by the British press and public was the reception that the email's content required, which was the reception of something that had been suspected from the pattern of Andrew's conduct across the decade of the trade envoy role, and that the emails had now established in the documented form that the pattern had not previously provided. The suspicion had been the suspicion assembled from the Kazakhstan relationship and the Libya relationship and the Equatorial Guinea associations and the helicopter expenses and the general quality of the trade envoy decade's conduct that Andrew's previous accounts, and this account in its predecessor, had established. The emails were the documentation of the suspicion's most specific and most legally significant dimension, which was the dimension of the confidential government information whose sharing with an unauthorized private individual constituted the specific conduct that the misconduct in public office charge was organized around addressing. The emails were also the documentation that made the specific connection between the 2 dimensions of Andrew's relationship with Epstein that the previous public account of the relationship had always kept in separate frames, because the previous public account had been organized either around the social dimension, the parties, and the photographs, and the nightclubs, and the Central Park Walk, or around the alleged sexual dimension, the Virginia Giuffre allegations, and the settlement, and the stepped back from public duties narrative, without connecting those dimensions to the professional dimension, the trade envoy role, and its access, and the specific mechanism by which the trade envoy's confidential material had been making its way into Epstein's inbox. The connection, established by the emails, was the connection of a relationship that had been operating across 3 simultaneous dimensions, the social, the alleged sexual, and the professional, and that had been providing Epstein with the access that all 3 dimensions generated simultaneously, rather than sequentially or alternatively. The social dimension provided the specific variety of the royal presence that legitimized Epstein's operation in the eyes of the people whose assessment of that legitimacy was organized around proximity to the monarchy. The alleged sexual dimension provided the specific content that the operation was built around facilitating. The professional dimension provided the confidential commercial intelligence that a man managing vast financial interests across the territories that Andrew was visiting as trade envoy would have found valuable in ways that the specific content of the intelligence made legible to anyone who examined the email's subject matter. The examination of the email's subject matter by the people whose professional function included examining such subject matter produced. In January 2026, when the emails were released, the specific outcome of the Republic Organisation's chief executive Graham Smith filing a formal complaint with the Thames Valley Police, and in February 2026 the specific outcome of the Thames Valley Police confirming it was assessing the complaint and assessing whether the allegations met the threshold for a formal investigation, and in February 2026 the specific outcome of the birthday arrest, which was the arrest that the assessment of the complaint had produced when the assessment concluded that the threshold had been met. The trade envoy emails were the most precisely documented of the allegations, because they were the allegations that existed in the form of the documentary record rather than in the form of testimony or witness account or the contested photograph, and the documentary record's specific quality is the quality of the thing that does not require corroboration in the way that testimony requires corroboration, because the document is its own corroboration. The emails showed what they showed, the timestamps showed what they showed. The 5-minute interval between Patel sending the visit reports and Andrew forwarding them to Epstein showed what it showed, which was the interval of a man who had decided, before he had even finished reading what he had received, that the person who needed to see it was the convicted sex offender whose inbox was waiting. The trade envoy role had been the Queen's wish. This is the dimension of the appointment's history, that the files released in May 2026 established through the internal government documents that the appointment had generated, and the establishing was the establishing of a fact whose institutional implications the file's reception by the British public required to be processed, alongside the implications of the trade envoy emails, because the fact that the appointment had been the Queen's wish was the fact that placed the specific quality of the appointment's management in the institutional context that the appointment required to be examined in. The Queen had expressed the wish. The government had acceded to the wish. The vetting that would normally accompany an appointment of this sensitivity had not been conducted with the thoroughness that the appointment's sensitivity required, because the appointment was the appointment of the Queen's son, and the Queen had expressed the wish, and the specific gravity of those two facts had organized the vetting in the direction of the accommodation of the wish, rather than the assessment of the appointee. What the assessment of the appointee would have found, if the assessment had been conducted with the thoroughness that the trade envoy role's confidentiality requirements demanded, was the file that the Special Branch and MI5 had been accumulating on Andrew's social world since at least the early 2000s, and the file's contents were the contents that the people who had been watching the social world could not share with the people who were managing the appointment, without the sharing producing the consequence that the sharing of intelligence files about a member of the royal family would produce, which was the consequence of the institutional awkwardness, whose management cost the institution judged to be higher than the cost of the appointment's management without the file's contents. The appointment was made without the thoroughness. Andrew became the trade envoy. The trade envoy had access to the confidential commercial intelligence. The confidential commercial intelligence reached Epstein's inbox 5 minutes after it reached Andrew's. Epstein was not the only person whose relationship with Andrew the FBI wanted to examine. The file's disclosure of the second investigation, the investigation that established that Andrew's social world had extended to a second convicted sex offender, is what the next part of this account examines, because the second investigation and the specific geography of its occurrence, a private Caribbean island owned by a man who was subsequently convicted of sexual assaults and accused of raping girls as young as 14, is the dimension of Andrew's private circle, whose existence the public account of the Epstein relationship had been preventing from receiving adequate attention. Peter Nygard was not Jeffrey Epstein. The comparison is not one that the available evidence supports, in the sense of the two men being the same category of person, operating the same category of operation, through the same category of mechanism. But the comparison is one that the available evidence requires to be made in the specific sense that the two men appear in the same document. The FBI's April 2020 letter to the British authorities requesting a voluntary interview with Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, as the two separate subjects of two separate investigations into the sex trafficking of minors, with whom Andrew had a documented social relationship, and the appearance of two convicted sex offenders, in the same letter, addressed to the same person, is the appearance that the pattern of Andrew's social world requires to be examined, rather than treated as a coincidence. The letter was dated April 2020. It was sent from the FBI's legal attaché in London to the relevant British authorities, requesting that Andrew attend a voluntary interview, and it specified that the interview would address two investigations. The first was the Epstein investigation that the public had been following since Epstein's death in August 2019. The second was an investigation into Peter Nygard. The letter documented that Andrew had visited Nygard's private resort in the Bahamas on at least one occasion. The investigation has revealed, the letter read, that on at least one occasion, Prince Andrew traveled to Nygard Cay in the Bahamas, a location where Nygard is believed to have trafficked minor and adult female victims. The letter stressed that Andrew was not a target of the investigation and that there was no evidence he had committed any crime under American law, and requested that he share any information he had gathered on Nygard and other related individuals. The letter was not acted on in the specific sense that the FBI's request for a voluntary interview produced in Andrew the zero cooperation that the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Geoffrey Berman, had publicly characterized as Andrew's response to the Epstein investigation's interview requests. And the characterization of zero cooperation was the characterization of a man who had told the world in the Newsnight interview of November 2019 that he was prepared to cooperate with any appropriate law enforcement agency if required, and who had then declined every specific request from the specific law enforcement agency that had identified itself as appropriate and had specified the requirement. Peter Nygard was born Peter Nygard in Finland in 1941 and built his fortune in the Canadian fashion industry across the following decades, creating a women's clothing empire that at its peak generated revenues of hundreds of millions of dollars annually, and that made him one of the most prominent figures in the Canadian business world of the 1980s and 1990s. The empire was real and substantial. It was also, by the evidence that the subsequent criminal proceedings established, the vehicle through which a man of considerable wealth and social access had been conducting across the same decades a parallel operation whose specific character the criminal convictions eventually defined in the terms that the criminal law applies to the evidence that meets its standards of proof. In November 2024, a Canadian jury convicted Peter Nygard, then 83 years old, of 4 counts of sexual assault against 4 women. The assaults had occurred between the late 1980s and 2005. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison. The conviction was the Canadian conviction, in the specific jurisdiction of the Canadian criminal law, on the charges that the Canadian prosecution had been able to establish to the jury's satisfaction. It was not the only criminal exposure he faced. He faced separate sexual assault and sex trafficking charges in Montreal, in Winnipeg, and in the United States. And the American charges included the accusation of raping girls as young as 14, and the operation that the American investigation had been examining was an operation whose specific character the available documents described in the terms that the Epstein operation's character had also been described, which were the terms of the systematic recruitment and trafficking of young women and girls through the mechanism of the private island and the private parties, and the network of facilitators that wealth and social access generate when they are deployed in the direction of the specific purposes that the convictions and the charges had established. The private island was Nygard Cay, a resort property in the Bahamas that Nygard had developed across the years of his commercial success into the specific environment that wealthy men with a taste for the kind of hospitality that private islands provide develop their private islands into, which is the environment of the exclusive and the controlled, the place whose geography and whose ownership and whose guest list are all determined by the same person, and that therefore provides to the person who controls it the specific variety of the unchecked that the controlled environment makes available when the checking is not in the interests of the controller. Nygard Cay was that environment, and by the evidence of the criminal proceedings against Nygard and the civil proceedings that had preceded them, the environment had been used for the purposes that the controlled environment makes available when the controller's purposes are the purposes that Nygard's convictions established. Andrew visited Nygard Cay in 2000. This is the year that the FBI's April 2020 letter established, and it is the year that places the visit in a specific biographical context, the same period as the first allegations by Virginia Giuffre, who said the first of the 3 encounters she described occurred in London in 2001. Andrew was already in the social world that Epstein and Maxwell had constructed, was already visiting the private Caribbean properties of the wealthy men whose hospitality the social world generated, and was visiting Nygaard Cay in the same year that his social calendar was also including Epstein's Manhattan townhouse and Epstein's Palm Beach estate, and the specific circuit of the international wealthy class, whose parties and properties constituted the social world, that the trade envoy role, and the royal title, and the specific combination of access and prominence that both provided, had made available to him. The pattern that the FBI's letter identified, by naming two separate investigations and two separate men in the same document addressed to the same person, was the pattern of someone whose social world kept producing the same category of person, regardless of the specific individual, which was the category of the wealthy man whose social world was organized around the specific hospitality that the private island and the controlled environment provided, and whose hospitality had been found, in both of the cases the FBI letter named, to have been the hospitality of someone who was using the controlled environment for purposes that the criminal law eventually addressed. Andrew visited both environments. He knew both men. He received both men's hospitality. The FBI's letter did not suggest he had done anything wrong in either environment. It asked him to share what he knew. He declined. The Steve Scully account arrived in the files and required the specific treatment that accounts of this kind require, which is the treatment of a witness account that has been preserved in an FBI document and that therefore carries the weight of the official record, while also carrying the specific limitations of a witness account that has not been tested by the cross-examination that the trial process applies to testimony of this character. Steve Scully had worked for Epstein in the early 2000s, and his account of what he had observed was preserved in an FBI report that the Epstein files released. He told investigators that he saw Andrew on Epstein's island and recalled him grinding against some young girl in the pool. The account stood in the FBI record as the account of a person who had been present and who had described what he had seen, and it stood alongside the accounts that the FBI's systematic review of the Epstein investigation had produced from the other witnesses and the other documents. And it stood in the specific context of the FBI's 2026 conclusion, announced in a two-page memo that ended the formal investigation, that there was no evidence to predicate an investigation against uncharged third parties. The conclusion was the conclusion of the formal investigation's end. It was not the conclusion that the Scully account was false, or that the pattern of the available evidence had produced an inaccurate picture. It was the conclusion of the institutional process that had been examining the evidence and that had determined, on the basis of the evidentiary standards the institution applied, that the evidence did not meet the threshold for the investigation of uncharged third parties. The threshold for the investigation of uncharged third parties, in the specific context of the misconduct in public office charge under British law, was a different threshold from the threshold for the investigation of sex crime allegations under American law, and the different threshold produced the different outcome of the birthday arrest, which was the outcome of the British investigation having reached the conclusion that the British threshold had been met, while the American investigation was reaching the conclusion that the American threshold had not been met in the specific category of the sex crime allegations. The two investigations were examining different categories of alleged conduct under different legal frameworks with different evidentiary standards, and the different outcomes were the outcomes of the different frameworks rather than contradictory assessments of the same evidence. The congressional aide's observation, quoted in the weeks following the birthday arrest, that what had been seen from the UK names was just the opening chapter, and that pressure was still mounting in Washington and London alike, and the fallout was only going to intensify, was the observation of someone with access to the content of the unreleased portions of the file, and who was describing the relationship between the released portions and the unreleased ones, in the terms that the relationship required. The released portions had produced the trade envoy emails, and the Nygaard letter, and the Scully account, and the Balmoral emails, and the Peru emails, and the photographs, and the 173 appearances. The unreleased portions were the portions that the continuing investigation and the continuing classification determinations had not yet produced in the form of public disclosure, and the characterization of the released portions as the opening chapter was the characterization of someone who had read more of the chapters than the public had been given access to. What the public had been given access to was sufficient to establish the outline of a private social world whose dimensions were larger than the public account of the Epstein relationship had established, and whose connections extended beyond Epstein in the documented direction of at least one other convicted sex offender whose private resort Andrew had visited in the same period that he was also visiting Epstein's properties. The outline was not the full picture. The congressional aide's characterization of it as the opening chapter suggested that the full picture was a picture whose dimensions exceeded the outline in ways that the subsequent releases would establish, and the subsequent releases had been establishing those dimensions in the specific increments that the release process produced across the months between the initial tranche and the ongoing investigation's continuation. The ongoing investigation was the investigation that the birthday arrest had formalized in British jurisdiction, and the formalization was the formalization of the misconduct in public office charge, rather than the sex crime allegations that the American investigation had concluded did not meet its threshold. And the British charge was the charge whose specific legal basis was the trade envoy emails and the confidential information whose transmission to Epstein, the 5-minute interval, and the Christmas Eve Helmand brief, and the October 2010 Asia trip details had documented in the form that the documentary record provides. The documentary record, assembled from the trade envoy emails, and the Nygaard FBI letter, and the Scully account, and the Balmoral correspondence, and the Peru exchanges, and the photographs, and the 173 appearances, was the record that the public version of Andrew's situation had not contained, and the record's assembly in the public domain across the months of the file releases had produced the public understanding that the investigation required to be accompanied by, and that the investigation itself was being conducted alongside. The investigation and the public understanding were proceeding in parallel, each producing the information that the parallel process generates when two processes are examining the same subject from different positions. The investigation from the position of the evidentiary standard, and the public understanding from the position of the available evidence, and the two positions were producing the same picture from different angles, and the picture was the picture of a private social world whose character the files were establishing in the cumulative form that cumulative evidence always produces, which is the form of the pattern that the individual pieces do not separately establish, but that the assembled pieces make unavoidable. The pattern's most recent piece was Peter Nygaard. The FBI's letter had named him alongside Epstein in the same document addressed to the same person, because the FBI's investigation had established that the same person had visited both men's private Caribbean properties and had received both men's hospitality and had known both men in the specific way that the social world of the wealthy and the titled and the prominently connected generates knowledge of the people who move through it, which is the knowledge of the dinner table and the private party and the island visit, rather than the knowledge of the documentary record that the criminal proceedings eventually produce. The dinner table knowledge and the island visit knowledge were the knowledge that the social world's participants carried and that the FBI's letter was requesting that Andrew share, and the sharing of it was the thing that the zero cooperation had prevented and that the birthday arrest was attempting to compel through the mechanism that the British criminal law provides for compelling the sharing of information that the person who holds it has declined to provide voluntarily. The sharing had not happened voluntarily. The compelling was underway. The photographs were in Jeffrey Epstein's possession. This is the fact about the photographs that the Department of Justice's release of them established before the photographs' content established anything, because the fact of their possession is the fact that organizes the content's meaning, and the content's meaning is different depending on whether the photographs are in the possession of the person who took them, or the person who requested them, or the person who was given them, or the person who collected them for purposes that the collection served. Epstein collected things. The investigation of his operation had established, across the years of its examination of the properties and the files and the servers and the records that his death had left available for examination, that the collecting was not the passive accumulation of the person who receives what comes to them, but the active assembly of the person who has decided that certain categories of material serve certain purposes, and who organizes the collection around the purposes that the material serves. The material that served the purposes Epstein had organized his operation around was the material that established the connections between him and the people he was connected to, and that established the character of those connections in the specific form that makes the character most useful to the person who holds it, which is the form of the image rather than the document, because the image establishes what it establishes without the requirement of the decoding that the document requires, and without the ambiguity that the verbal account permits. A photograph of a person in a specific location with a specific other person, or in a specific position in relation to a specific other person, establishes the connection and the character of the connection in the single image, whose content is legible to anyone who sees it, which is the specific quality of the photograph as evidence of the kind that Epstein was assembling. The December 19, 2025 release was the first release to include photographs of Andrew, and the first photograph to be released was the photograph taken at Sandringham. Sandringham is the private royal estate in Norfolk, where the British royal family has maintained its private residence since 1862, and it is the specific estate whose private character is the character of the inner sanctum, the place that exists beyond the ceremonial geography of Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, and that represents, in the institutional vocabulary of the British monarchy, the genuinely personal rather than the publicly maintained. It is the place where the Queen dies, by the precedent that two 20th-century sovereigns established by dying there. It is the place where the royal family gathers at Christmas, by the tradition that the gathering has maintained across the century and a half of the estate's royal ownership. It is the place that represents, in the shorthand of the royal coverage, the private heart of the institution's domestic life. Ghislaine Maxwell was in that place. The photograph established this. It was taken in the saloon room of Sandringham, a room whose architectural features the experts who examined the photograph identified from the distinctive elements of the room's decoration that the image contained, which were the elements of the ornate fireplace and the specific quality of the room's furnishings that Sandringham's interior photography, available in the public record of the estate's history, allowed the identification to be made. The photograph showed Andrew lying across the laps of 5 women in black tie attire, his eyes closed and a smile on his face, their faces redacted by the Department of Justice in the standard form that the releases applied to the faces of people who had not been publicly identified as participants in the investigation's subject matter. Maxwell stood behind the group, looking down at Andrew, smiling. She had been to Sandringham. He had brought her there, or she had come there with his facilitation, or the two of them had been there at the occasion that the black tie attire and the formal room and the 5 formally dressed women and the framed photograph indicated was the kind of occasion that Sandringham hosted, and the hosting of Ghislaine Maxwell at the kind of occasion that Sandringham hosted was the hosting that had produced the photograph that was now in the Department of Justice's released files, because the photograph had been in Jeffrey Epstein's possession, and the photograph had been in Epstein's possession because someone had given it to him, or he had obtained it, or it had been produced, in the context of the relationship between Maxwell and Epstein that made Maxwell's photographs the photographs that Epstein's collection included. The January 30, 2026 release was the release that produced the photographs whose content required the most immediate and the most extensive commentary, because the photographs of Andrew kneeling over a woman on a floor were the photographs that the visual record of the Epstein files had not previously contained in the form of the specific image that the kneeling photographs provided. There were 3 photographs in the release. In the first, Andrew was on all fours, his hand resting on the abdomen of a woman lying on her back, on a floor that the investigators who examined the image identified as consistent with the floor of the dining room of Epstein's Manhattan townhouse at 9 East 71st Street, the property where Andrew had acknowledged staying on the December 2010 visit, during which he claimed to have ended the friendship. In the second photograph, he was looking directly into the camera while crouched over the same woman, whose face was redacted in the standard form. In the third, his hands were resting on either side of her body, while he remained on his knees above her. The woman was clothed in all 3 photographs. Andrew was clothed in all 3 photographs. The Department of Justice provided no context for the photographs, and did not identify when or where they were taken, beyond the circumstantial identification of the floor's consistency with the Manhattan townhouse's dining room that the investigators' examination of the image had produced. The photographs were not the photographs of a crime, as the criminal law defines crime. They were the photographs of a situation that the images established without the images establishing what the situation was, or what had preceded or followed the moment the images captured. And the specific uncertainty of the image's meaning was the uncertainty that the Department of Justice's statement that it had provided the photographs without context had maintained by design. Because the provision of context was the provision that the ongoing investigation had determined was not appropriate to make in the specific phase of the investigation that the January 2026 release represented. What the images established without context was what the images established, which was a former member of the British royal family, in a position over a woman whose identity had been redacted by the investigators managing the release, in a location consistent with the property of a convicted sex offender, in photographs that had been in the possession of the convicted sex offender, and that the investigation of the convicted sex offender's operation had found among the material that the operation had assembled. The images established that this material was in Epstein's collection. They established that the collection included photographs whose subject was Andrew in a specific relationship to a specific woman in a specific location. They established that Epstein had considered the collection of this material a collection worth making. The timing of the photographs relative to the public record had been examined by the journalists covering the file's release, and the examination had produced a specific finding about the first of the three photographs, which was the finding that the jeans Andrew was wearing in the photograph were jeans that appeared to match the jeans visible in a photograph taken during the Central Park Walk of December 2, 2010. The Central Park Walk had been documented by press photographers who had captured Andrew and Epstein walking together in the park, and the photographs from that walk included the image of Andrew, whose clothing the journalists were now comparing to the clothing visible in the Epstein files photograph. The comparison was not a forensic comparison, conducted with the instruments of the investigative photography analysis. It was a visual comparison, conducted by journalists, who had access to both images, and who had identified what appeared to be the same distinctive genes in both. And the identification was reported as a circumstantial indication that the kneeling photographs had been taken during the same Manhattan visit during which the Central Park Walk had occurred, which was the visit that Andrew had represented as the visit during which he had ended the friendship. The photographs had been taken during the farewell visit. The email confirmation of the Virginia Giuffre photograph was contained in a different section of the files, in the emails exchanged between Epstein and various parties in 2011, when the Daily Mail was preparing to publish Giuffre's account of her allegations. The confirmation was not the confirmation of a legal admission. It was the confirmation that the email exchange produced, in which Epstein's correspondence about the photograph that showed Andrew with his arm around Giuffre's waist, with Maxwell standing alongside, discussed the image in the specific terms of the person who understood the image to be authentic, rather than the terms of the person who was disputing its authenticity. The discussion was the discussion of how to manage the damage the image would produce when it was published, not the discussion of whether the image was real. The Buckingham Palace dinner invitation appeared in the files in a different form from the photographs, which was the form of the document rather than the image, and the document was the invitation that Epstein had received to dine at Buckingham Palace, found among the correspondence and the records that his operation had accumulated and that the investigation had found. The invitation established, in the specific form of the formal document of the most significant royal residence in the United Kingdom, that Epstein's access to the Windsor social world had extended to the palace itself, and the extension was the extension that the Sandringham photograph had established at the private end of the royal geography, and that the palace dinner invitation established at the ceremonial end, and together they established the specific scope of the access that the relationship had provided. The scope of the access was the scope that the possession of the photographs and the invitation established, and the establishment was the establishment of what Epstein had been collecting and why. The people who investigated financial crimes and intelligence operations, and the specific variety of the operation that Epstein ran, had developed a vocabulary for what Epstein was doing with the material he collected, and the vocabulary was the vocabulary of the leverage that the material provides to the person who holds it. The person who holds a photograph of a prominent individual in a compromising position has a specific relationship to the prominent individual that the photograph creates. which is the relationship of the person who can produce the photograph and the person who does not want the photograph produced. And the relationship is a relationship of power in the specific sense that the possession of the material organizes the terms of the subsequent relationship between the holder and the person in the photograph in the direction of the holder's interest. The FBI's investigation into the Epstein operation had examined the leverage thesis as one of the frameworks for understanding what Epstein was building with the social world he was constructing and the material he was collecting, and the two-page memo that the FBI released in 2026 announcing the end of the formal investigation had noted that the investigation had not uncovered evidence that Epstein was murdered, kept a client list, or blackmailed powerful figures. The not uncovering was the conclusion of the formal investigation's evidentiary assessment, and it was not the same as the conclusion that the leverage thesis was wrong, because the not uncovering of evidence is a different conclusion from the evidence of the not occurring. The evidence of the not occurring would require the evidence that the material was never deployed in the direction that the leverage thesis suggested it was assembled for, and the evidence of the not occurring was not available in the form that the formal investigation could have produced it, even if the formal investigation had concluded that the thesis was correct. What was available was the photographs and the invitation and the emails and the 173 appearances and the pattern of the collection across the decades of the operation's accumulation. And the pattern was the pattern of a man who had understood the specific utility of the material and who had assembled it with the consistency of someone who had decided that the material served a purpose and who was building the collection in the direction of the purpose's service. Whether the purpose was the purpose that the leverage thesis described or a different purpose, the pattern of the assembly was the pattern of the deliberate rather than the incidental, and the deliberateness was the quality that the collection's specific content required to be explained. The specific content included the photographs of the prominent British royal in the positions that the images captured, taken in the property that the identification of the floor had placed them in, at the time that the genes comparison had suggested they had been taken, found in the possession of the convicted sex offender whose operation had produced the material by the specific mechanism of the controlled environment and the social world and the hospitality that the controlled environment generated, and that the prominent British royal had been receiving across the years of the social world's construction. The receiving of the hospitality and the photographs of the receiving being in the collection of the person providing the hospitality. This was what the files had established in the form that the files established things, which was the form of the documentary record and the photographic record, rather than the form of the witness account or the contested claim, and the form of the documentary and the photographic record was the form that required the least additional corroboration because the documents and the photographs were themselves the corroboration of what they showed. What they showed, assembled from the Sandringham photograph and the 3 kneeling photographs and the Buckingham Palace dinner invitation and the emails confirming the Giuffre photograph's authenticity, was the specific scope of an access that the public account of the Epstein relationship had not established in the terms that the files were now establishing, because the public account had been organized around the social dimension of the friendship, the parties, and the walks and the photographs at charity events, rather than the documentary dimension of what Epstein had been collecting about the friendship, and where the collecting had taken him, and what the collection contained. The collection contained Sandringham. The collection contained the palace dinner invitation. The collection contained Andrew kneeling over a woman in the December 2010 photographs, taken on what Andrew had represented as the visit during which he ended the friendship. The collection contained 173 appearances of the name of the person who was now the most frequently cited British figure in 23,000 documents assembled by the Justice Department of the United States about the operation of a convicted sex offender. The collection was what Epstein kept. The keeping was what the investigation found. Peter Mandelson was arrested on the 23rd of February 2026. It was a Monday. 4 days earlier, on the Thursday, that was Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's 66th birthday. The 6 unmarked vehicles had arrived at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate. 4 days after that, plainclothes officers arrived at Mandelson's home in the London borough of Camden, and he was led to a waiting car and driven to a police station, and the Metropolitan Police issued a statement describing the arrest of a 72-year-old man on suspicion of misconduct in public office. The statement did not name him. The television cameras that had positioned themselves outside his home did not need the statement to name him. The two arrests, separated by 4 days, were the two arrests that converted the Epstein scandal from the story of a disgraced royals association with a convicted sex offender into something whose dimensions required a different accounting, because the story of the disgraced royals association had been the story that the preceding years of management and the Newsnight interview and the settlement and the stepping back and the eviction battle had produced, and the story was large and damaging and had consumed a significant portion of the institutional management capacity of the British monarchy since 2019. The second arrest was the arrest of a man who was not a member of the royal family and was not a disgraced royal and was not someone whose institutional position had been the subject of the preceding year's management, but was instead the most senior Labour Party politician of his generation and the most recently appointed British ambassador to the United States, and the person whose connection to Epstein had been a matter of public knowledge and public management for years before the files converted the public knowledge into the publicly documented. Peter Benjamin Mandelson was born in 1953, the grandson of Herbert Morrison, the Labour politician who had served as Deputy Prime Minister under Clement Attlee, and whose political lineage had organised the younger Mandelson's entry into the Labour Party and its subsequent ascent in the specific way that political lineages organize the entries and ascents of the people they produce. He had been the strategic architect of New Labour, the political project that Tony Blair had carried to 3 consecutive election victories from 1997, and the architectural function was the function that had made Mandelson the most significant single figure in the political management of those victories. The person whose understanding of how the electorate's relationship to political parties could be reorganized through the specific instruments of the message and the image and the management of the message and the image had transformed the Labour Party from the party that had lost 4 consecutive general elections into the party that won 3. The transformation had produced in Mandelson the specific variety of political prominence that the transformation's architect acquires when the transformation succeeds, which was the prominence of the indispensable and the feared, the person whose influence was large enough and whose methods were opaque enough that the political world organized its assessment of him around the specific combination of respect and wariness that the indispensable and the feared generate in the environments they inhabit. He was called the Prince of Darkness. The name was applied with the mixture of admiration and discomfort that names of that register attract when the person they are applied to has earned the application through the specific quality of intelligence deployed in the specific direction of the politically effective rather than the politically transparent. He had been a cabinet minister twice under Blair and once under Gordon Brown, serving as business secretary from 2008 to 2010, the period that coincided precisely with the period of the Epstein allegations against him, which were the allegations that he had used his position as business secretary to share an internal government report with Epstein, and had communicated to Epstein that he would lobby for a reduction in the tax on bankers' bonuses when he held that position. The allegations were not the allegations of the sexual misconduct that the Epstein operation's primary victims had described, and that the Giuffre lawsuit and the Maxwell conviction had established. They were the allegations of the professional misconduct, the specific category of the official's use of the official position in the direction of the private interest that the misconduct in public office charge addressed, and they were the allegations that the files had documented in the form of the emails and the notes that the investigation had assembled and that the January and February 2026 releases had made public. The J.P. Morgan Internal Risk Assessment of 2019, the document that had been filed to a New York court in 2023 and that had established the financial institution's institutional awareness of the relationship between its former client Epstein and the people Epstein maintained the closest relationships with, had named 2 British figures in the specific terms of the particularly close. The document described Epstein as appearing to maintain a particularly close relationship with Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, and Lord Peter Mandelson, a senior member of the British government. J.P. Morgan had been Epstein's banker. J.P. Morgan's internal assessment of its client's network had identified the same two people that the FBI's April 2020 letter to the British authorities had been addressed to the same person about, and the JP Morgan assessment and the FBI letter had been produced independently of each other by different institutions operating in different jurisdictions under different legal frameworks, and their independent identification of the same two British figures as the figures with the particularly close relationships was the independent corroboration that the convergence of independent assessments produces. The birthday tribute was the document that the files produced in the form that the public found most immediately legible, because the birthday tribute was the document in the genre of the personal rather than the professional, the specific genre that produces the most revealing content about the private relationship behind the professional context. In 2003, Mandelson had written a tribute to Epstein on the occasion of Epstein's birthday, and the tribute had described Epstein in the terms that a person uses when they are writing for the recipient rather than for any audience beyond the recipient. And the terms were the terms of my best pal. The man who would be convicted 6 years later of soliciting prostitution from a minor, who would be registered as a sex offender and serve 13 months of an 18-month sentence, who would be arrested again in 2019 on federal sex trafficking charges, and who would die in a Manhattan detention cell before those charges could be tried, was described in 2003 by Peter Mandelson, then a senior figure in the government of the United Kingdom, as my best pal. The tribute's specific language was the language of intimacy, and the intimacy it described was the intimacy of two people who had moved from the social acquaintance that the dinner party and the party circuit generates into the specific relationship that the My Best Pal register describes, which is the relationship of people who have decided that the other person is the person they trust and whose company they seek, and to whom they direct the specific quality of affection that the birthday tribute format requires the writer to produce, and that the My Best Pal formulation had produced in the most precise available terms. Mandelson's public account of his relationship with Epstein had been organized, since the relationship first became a matter of public attention, around the specific framing of the regretted introduction. He had told the Financial Times that he regretted ever meeting Epstein or being introduced to him by his partner Ghislaine Maxwell, and that he regretted even more the hurt Epstein had caused to many young women. When the FT journalist pressed him further on the relationship's details, he had told the journalist that he was not going to go into this, and that it was an FT obsession, and that frankly they could all fuck off. The response was the response of a man who had concluded that the question's further engagement was the thing the question required him not to provide, and who was communicating the conclusion in the specific terms of someone who had decided that the directness of the refusal was the more defensible position than the management of the engagement's appearance. The directness of the refusal had not prevented the engagement's continuation, because the files had continued to arrive, and the file's content had continued to add the dimension to the relationship's public account that the refusal had been designed to prevent. The September 2025 release had surfaced the emails and notes that showed Mandelson maintaining supportive contact with Epstein after the 2008 conviction, which was the period during which Epstein had been convicted and registered as a sex offender, and Mandelson had remained, by the evidence of the maintaining contact, in the specific relationship that the maintaining contact established, which was the relationship of someone who had decided that the conviction was not the thing that required the relationship's termination. The maintaining of the contact after the conviction was the specific behavior that the files documented in Mandelson's case as they had documented it in Andrew's case, and the parallel of the two behaviors produced the parallel of the two assessments of the behaviors that the file's public reception had generated, and the parallel of the two assessments was the parallel that the two arrests had converted into the parallel of the two institutional responses to the behaviors, which was the response of the Thames Valley Police in Andrew's case and the Metropolitan Police in Mandelson's, 4 days apart, on the same charge. Starmer's response to Mandelson's arrest was the response of a Prime Minister managing a crisis that had arrived in the form of the arrest of the person he had appointed to one of British diplomacy's most prestigious posts, and whose connection to Epstein had been a matter of public knowledge before the appointment, and whose appointment Starmer had made despite the public knowledge. He had fired Mandelson from the ambassadorial role before the arrest, when the earlier revelations about the file's content had made the ambassador's continued presence in Washington the institutional liability that the institutional management had concluded was no longer sustainable. He had then urged Mandelson to resign from the House of Lords, the lifetime appointment that had survived the ambassadorial firing, and that the additional revelations had made the additional target of the calls for the additional accountability. After the arrest, he described the law as needing to take its course, in the specific formulation that Charles had used about Andrew 4 days earlier, and the identical formulation from the two most senior figures in the British institutional hierarchy about the two arrested men in the same week was the identical formulation of two institutions communicating in the same language, the same institutional conclusion about the same category of situation applied to two different people. Mandelson resigned from the Labour Party on the Sunday before his arrest. He had been told, or had concluded, that the additional revelations that the weekend's journalism had produced about the alleged financial payments from Epstein were the revelations that required the resignation before the arrest confirmed what the resignation would otherwise have been required to explain. The resignation statement said he did not wish to cause further embarrassment to Labour, and the further was the word that established that the resignation was the acknowledgement of the embarrassment that had preceded it, rather than the preemption of the embarrassment that the arrest would produce. And the acknowledgement was the acknowledgement of a man who had spent his adult life in the management of political appearances, and who understood that the management's capacity had been exhausted by the evidence whose content the management could no longer address. The specific allegations against Mandelson that the files had documented were the allegations of the internal government report shared with Epstein and the lobbying commitment communicated to Epstein about the banker's bonus tax. The allegations were allegations, which meant they were the subject of the investigation rather than the conclusions of the investigation. And the investigation had not produced charges at the point of this accounts assembly, and the charges had not been produced at the point of this accounts assembly. What had been produced was the arrest, which was the arrest of the formal investigation that the misconduct in public office charge required to be initiated, and the formal investigation was proceeding alongside the formal investigation into Andrew's conduct, and the two formal investigations were proceeding in the specific context of the file's continued release and the continued addition of the material that the release was making available. The two investigations, proceeding in parallel into two of the most prominent figures in British public life of the preceding 4 decades, were the investigations that the files had made available by providing the specific documentary material that the investigations required to be initiated, and the initiating of the investigations was the institutional response to the material that the institutional response to the file's public release had produced. The response was the arrest, and the arrest was the formalization of the investigation, and the formalization was the outcome of the files producing the evidence that the threshold required to be met before the formalization could occur. The threshold had been met twice, the same week, with 4 days between the two meetings of the threshold, in two of the largest institutions of British public life, the monarchy and the Labour Party, by two men whose proximity to Epstein's operation had been maintained across the years in which the proximity's public knowledge had been the public knowledge, and whose proximity to each other in the J.P. Morgan's institutional assessment of Epstein's network had been the assessment that named them together as the people whose relationships with Epstein were the relationships that were particularly close. Particularly close, the two words that J.P. Morgan's internal assessment had applied to the relationships that the two arrested men had maintained with the convicted sex offender, the two words that the January 2026 files had documented in the emails, and the notes whose content the financial institution's assessment had been summarizing, were the two words that the 4-day interval between the two arrests had confirmed in the form that the institutional response of the arrest confirms what the institutional assessment had previously concluded, which is the form of the action rather than the assessment. The action was the arrest. The assessment was particularly close. Between the two, the specific dimension of Andrew's private circle that the previous public account of the circle had managed to keep in the form of the particular association with the particular convicted sex offender had been converted by the parallel arrest and the parallel charge, and the parallel investigation into something whose scope the particular association framing had not contained, which was the scope of the elite British network that the operation had been servicing, and the specific nature of the service that the network's members had been providing in return. The Financial Times published a piece in the years following Epstein's death that described the operation he had been running in terms that the financial newspaper's specific vocabulary made available, and that the financial vocabulary made more precise than any other available vocabulary for what Epstein had built, which was the description of a social Ponzi scheme. The Ponzi scheme is the financial fraud in which the returns paid to the earliest investors are funded not by the investment's actual productive capacity, but by the capital contributed by the subsequent investors, and the scheme's continuation requires the continuous recruitment of the subsequent investors, because without the subsequent investors' capital, the earlier investors' returns cannot be maintained, and the scheme's structure is exposed as the structure whose returns were always the returns of the recruitment, rather than the returns of the investment. The social Ponzi is the specific variety of the mechanism applied to the social world rather than the financial one, and what it describes in Epstein's case is the network whose value to each participant was the network's value rather than the value of any individual connection within it, and whose value to the network depended on the continuous addition of participants whose own social value exceeded the social value of the participants already in the network, because the Ponzi's logic requires the subsequent contribution to exceed the preceding one in order for the scheme's returns to be maintained. What Epstein was building across the decades of the operation was the network whose value proposition to each potential participant was the network's existing membership, and the membership's value was the membership's quality rather than its quantity, which was the quality of the participants' social and financial and political positions, rather than the number of people who occupied those positions. The network's value proposition was the proposition that the person being recruited to the network would, by joining it, be in the company of the most powerful and most prominent people in the world, and the being in the company was itself the value, because being in the company of the most powerful and most prominent produces the specific social capital that the company produces when it is witnessed by the people outside the company, for whom the witness confirms the importance of the witnessed. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's participation in the network served the network's Ponzi mechanism in the most precisely efficient available form, which was the form of the participant whose mere presence required no additional credential and whose presence conferred on every other participant the credential that the presence provided. A British prince at a dinner party does not need to produce his credentials. His presence at the dinner party is the credential, and his presence at the dinner party of a specific host is the credential of the host and of every other guest at the dinner, because the British prince has decided that the dinner party is worth attending, and the decision to attend is itself the social credential that the attendance confers. Epstein understood this before Andrew understood it, and understood it in the specific terms of the social Ponzi's logic, which was the terms of the subsequent investor whose capital exceeds the preceding investors, and who therefore enables the preceding investors' returns to be maintained at the level the scheme requires. The Buckingham Palace dinner invitation is the document that the Ponzi mechanism produced at its most extreme expression, because the Buckingham Palace dinner invitation is the invitation that converts the social Ponzi's logic into its purest available form. Epstein had been to Buckingham Palace for dinner. This was established by the invitation found in his files, and the invitation established that the social world that the network had assembled around the man who had been convicted of soliciting prostitution from a minor had extended, through the mechanism of the royal connection, to the dining room of the British sovereign's principal residence. The invitation was not the invitation of the sovereign. It was the invitation that the royal connection's maintenance of the social relationship with Epstein had produced, through the specific mechanism of the palace's social calendar, and the place that Andrew's position in the family gave him in the management of the invitations that the palace's social calendar generated. But the fact of the invitation was the fact of a convicted sex offender having had dinner at Buckingham Palace, and the fact that the social Ponzi's mechanism had produced, because the Ponzi required the credential to be the most significant available credential at each stage of the network's expansion, and the Buckingham Palace dinner invitation was the credential that represented the most significant available credential in the British social world's specific hierarchy of the significant. Having dined at the palace was the social credential that exceeded every other available social credential in the British context, and Epstein's possession of the credential was the possession that the royal connection had enabled. And the royal connection that had enabled it was the connection that Andrew had maintained, despite the conviction, and despite the zero cooperation, and despite the Newsnight interview, and despite everything the public management of the relationship's public account had been organized around presenting as the managed version of a regrettable friendship. The photographs that Congress had received numbered 95,000. The House Oversight Committee Democrats had made this number public in the specific context of the call for the complete release of the files, and the 95,000 was the number that established the scale of the documentary record that the Epstein estate had generated in the form of photographic evidence of the network's social operation. Because the 95,000 photographs were the photographs of the social world that the network had been building, and that the photography of the social world produced in the form of the record of the occasions on which the network's participants had been in the same rooms, and at the same tables, and on the same properties, and in the same social contexts, that the network's operation required. Elon Musk appeared in the files in the form of an email to Epstein. The email was an email from the early period of the relationship between Musk and Epstein that preceded Musk's own subsequent public account of the relationship, which was the account of a minimal and regretted connection, and the email's specific content, the asking about the wildest party, was the content of someone who was interested in the social world that the network represented rather than indifferent to it. The email was reported in the coverage of the file's release as the evidence of the interest that the subsequent public account of no significant connection had been managing, and the managing was the managing that the public account of the network's members' connections consistently required when the files produced the documentary evidence that the public accounts had been organized around not acknowledging. Bill Gates appeared in the files in the photographs that showed him in the company of Andrew at the 2018 Malaria Summit in London, and the photographs were the photographs that the House Oversight Committee had obtained and that had appeared in the released files in the form that Congress had received them, which was the form that included Andrew but had cropped out Charles, who had also been at the summit, and who had also appeared in the original Getty Images photograph, from which the released version had been produced by the removal of his image. The cropping was the cropping that the document's release required for the specific purpose that the document served in the context of the investigation, which was the purpose of establishing Andrew's presence at the occasion rather than the purpose of establishing Charles's, and the cropping's production of the image that served the investigation's purpose was the image that the coverage of the files had reproduced with the note about the cropping that the note required to be made. The 173 appearances in the files were the appearances that the cumulative record of the 23,000 documents produced when the documents were examined as a unified record rather than as the individual occasions that the individual documents described. The 173 appearances were the 173 times that the name Andrew or the Duke or some other identifier for the same person appeared in the assembled documentary record. And the appearing in the assembled documentary record was the appearing that established the cumulative picture of the relationship's scope and depth and duration that the individual appearances did not separately establish, but that the assembled appearances made the most extensively documented British dimension of the Epstein operations record. The cumulative record was the specific form of documentation that the social Ponzi required to be produced when the investigation of the social Ponzi applied the investigative attention to the documents that the operation had generated, because the social Ponzi's operation produces the social documentation in the specific form of the emails and the photographs and the travel logs and the calendars and the correspondence that the social world generates when it is operating at the scale and with the intentionality that Epstein's operation had been operating at, and the documentation's assembly into the cumulative record was the assembly that established the pattern rather than the individual incident, and the pattern was the pattern that the individual incidents did not separately produce, but that the assembled record made unavoidable. The pattern, assembled from the 173 appearances, was the pattern of a relationship that had been maintained across the social calendar and the travel itineraries and the correspondence and the photography of approximately 2 decades of the operation's operation. From the late 1990s, when the relationship had been established, through the Maxwell introduction to the 2010 farewell visit that had generated the Central Park photographs and the kneeling photographs and the Christmas Eve Helmand email and the March 2011 emails that had followed the farewell, and established that the farewell had been followed by correspondence that the farewell was supposed to have concluded. The pattern was not the pattern of the regretted friendship that had been reluctantly maintained too long and then ended. The pattern was the pattern of the sustained engagement whose maintenance had been organized around the specific utility that the engagement provided to both parties, and whose ending had been postponed for the specific reason that the utility was the utility that the ending would terminate. What the engagement provided to Andrew was the specific social world and the specific hospitality and the specific variety of the interesting that the network of the wealthy and the prominent and the globally connected provided to its members, and the interesting was the interesting of the person who had been formed inside the institutional world of the British monarchy and who had found in the Epstein network the specific quality of the world that the institutional world's specific formality and its specific management of the social calendar could not provide, which was the quality of the genuinely international and the genuinely powerful and the genuinely unconstrained by the institutional requirements that the royal context imposed on every social occasion the royal context generated. What Andrew provided to the network was the credential. The credential was the specific social capital of the British Royal that the network's social Ponzi mechanism required, in the form of the participant whose contribution to the network's value exceeded the contributions of the participants already in the network, and the credential was the contribution that the royal presence provided in the specific form of the legitimacy that the royal presence conferred on the occasions at which it appeared, and on the person who had organized the occasions at which it appeared, who was Epstein, and on the other participants at those occasions, who were the members of the network whose own participation in the network was made more legitimate by the royal's participation in the same network. The legitimacy that the royal presence conferred was the specific social capital that Epstein was using the participation to generate, and the generation was the generation of the credential that the social Ponzi required for the scheme's continuation, and the continuation required the credential's maintenance in the form of the maintained relationship rather than the terminated one, and the maintained relationship was the relationship that the 173 appearances documented in the form of the cumulative record that the scheme's operation had produced, and that the investigation of the scheme had assembled into the specific picture of a social Ponzi whose most valuable credentialing participant had been the person whose participation had been the most extensively documented British participation in the operation that the assembled record produced. The most extensively documented British participation was the participation of the man who had been arrested on his 66th birthday in a cottage on the Sandringham estate. The documentation was the 173 appearances. The appearances were the social Ponzi's record of its most valuable British credentialing participants' contribution to the scheme. The scheme's record was the Epstein files. The files were what remained. On the 27th of January 2020, Jeffrey Berman stood outside the former Manhattan townhouse of Jeffrey Epstein at 9 East 71st Street and told the assembled press that the United Kingdom's most famous private citizen had provided zero cooperation to the investigation that the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Office of the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York had been conducting into the sex trafficking operation that Epstein had run and that Maxwell had facilitated. The press conference was the press conference of a man who had decided that the zero cooperation required a public statement rather than the private management of the institution's frustration, and the decision to make a public statement about the zero cooperation was the decision that established, in the specific form of the public record that a U.S. attorney's press conference creates, that the person who had told the BBC in November 2019 that he was willing to help any appropriate law enforcement agency with their investigations, if required, had been required and had not helped. The zero cooperation was the specific characterization of a legal and institutional dynamic that the characterization's precision required to be unpacked, because the zero cooperation was not the characterization of a person who had been summoned and had refused to appear, which would have been the legal situation that the contempt mechanism addresses and that the American courts have the institutional capacity to enforce against people within their jurisdiction. The zero cooperation was the characterization of a person who was outside the American court's jurisdiction and who had therefore not been summoned in the form that the contempt mechanism requires, but had been asked in the form that the voluntary interview request provides. And the voluntary interview request is the form that the investigation uses when the person it wants to interview is a person whose cooperation is sought, rather than compelled. Andrew was in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is a foreign jurisdiction from the perspective of the American federal investigation, and the American federal investigation's relationship to the person it wants to interview, who is in a foreign jurisdiction, is the relationship of the institution that must proceed through the channels that the foreign jurisdiction's cooperation provides, rather than through the direct compulsion that the domestic jurisdiction's enforcement mechanisms would make available if the person were within it. The channels that the foreign jurisdiction's cooperation provides were the channels that the FBI's legal attaché in London had used when the April 2020 letter requesting a voluntary interview had been sent to the British authorities, and the channels had produced the letter, and the letter had been delivered, and the delivery had produced the zero cooperation that Berman had characterized. The zero cooperation's specific form was documented in the subsequent accounts of the process that the FBI and the Southern District had been attempting to conduct, and the documentation established that the zero cooperation had been communicated through Andrew's representatives in the form of the positions they had taken on the interview's terms, the conditions they had set for any participation, and the conclusions they had reached about the appropriateness of the requested cooperation that had collectively produced the outcome that Berman had characterized as zero. The positions and the conditions and the conclusions were the managed communication of the decision not to cooperate, conducted through the institutional channels that the legal representation of a prominent British individual produces when that individual has decided that the cooperation is not in their interest and has engaged the legal representation to communicate the decision in the form that preserves the maximum available distance between the decision and the characterization of the decision as uncooperative. The preservation of the distance had been the specific management achievement of Andrew's legal team across the period between the Newsnight interview's broadcast in November 2019 and the Berman press conference in January 2020, and the achievement was the achievement of a team that had managed to communicate the zero cooperation in the form of the managed positions and conditions, while preserving for Andrew the specific public narrative of the person who had expressed willingness to cooperate and who was working through the appropriate channels to make that cooperation available in the appropriate form. The narrative and the reality were the specifically different things that the Berman press conference had converted from the privately known to the publicly stated, because the press conference had taken the zero that the private management had been producing and placed it in the public record in the form that the U.S. Attorney's statement creates when the U.S. Attorney determines that the private management's continued accommodation is no longer the appropriate institutional response. The Southern District's investigation had been examining the Epstein operation since Epstein's arrest in July 2019, and the examination had been organized around the question that the Epstein prosecution had established as the investigation's primary question, which was the question of who else had participated in the operation, and in what capacity, and whether the participation met the evidentiary standards that the criminal law required to be met before the investigation could proceed in the direction of the charging decision. The question was the question that the Maxwell prosecution had been examining from the side of the facilitator, and the Maxwell conviction in December 2021 on 5 counts of sex trafficking and related crimes had established the facilitator's liability in the form that the criminal law provides when the evidence meets the standard. The question about the people who had participated as the operation's beneficiaries, rather than its facilitators, was the question that the investigation had continued to examine after the Maxwell conviction, and that the zero cooperation had been preventing from being examined in the most direct available form, which was the form of the interview with the person the question was about. The Senate Judiciary Committee letter had arrived on the 12th of February, 2022, 3 days before the settlement. The letter had been addressed to Andrew and had cited his Newsnight statement about his willingness to cooperate, and had noted that the occasion for that cooperation had arrived in the form of the federal investigation's continued examination of the people who had participated in the operation, and had requested that he make himself available for the interview that the willingness had implied would be available when the appropriateness had been established. The appropriateness had been established by the Senate Judiciary Committee's assessment that it had been established, and the letter was the communication of that assessment to the person whose willingness the assessment was being communicated to. The settlement was announced on the 15th of February, 3 days after the Senate Judiciary Committee letter. The settlement resolved the civil lawsuit that Virginia Giuffre had filed against Andrew in August 2021, and the settlement's terms included the provisions that Part 5 of the previous account had examined, which were the provisions of the financial payment and the behavioral restrictions and the gagging order. The settlement did not address the Senate Judiciary Committee's request for cooperation with the federal investigation. The settlement resolved the civil matter and left the federal investigation's cooperation question in the specific condition that the settlement's resolution of the civil matter required it to leave it, which was the condition of the unaddressed question that the resolution of a different question in a different proceeding had not answered. The FBI's 2-page memo, released by the Department of Justice in the same period as the final tranches of the Epstein files release, was the institutional document that announced the formal end of the investigation, and that did so in the specific language of the institutional conclusion that the evidentiary assessment had produced. The memo stated that the investigation had not uncovered evidence that Epstein was murdered, had not established the existence of a client list, and had not uncovered evidence that Epstein had blackmailed powerful figures. The memo's central statement about the investigation's conclusions regarding the people beyond Maxwell was the statement that the investigation had not uncovered evidence that could predicate an investigation against uncharged third parties following a systematic review of available evidence. The predicate word was the specific legal term whose meaning the memo's reception required to be understood in the specific sense that the American federal investigation's use of it required. To predicate an investigation is to establish the factual basis that the investigation requires to be initiated in compliance with the Department of Justice's guidelines for the initiation of investigations, which are the guidelines that require the existence of the specific factual circumstances that the investigation is organized to examine before the investigation can be formally opened. The not uncovering of evidence that could predicate an investigation was the not uncovering of the specific factual foundation that the Department of Justice's guidelines required to be present before the investigation could be opened, and the not uncovering was the conclusion of the systematic review rather than the conclusion that the factual foundation's absence had been established. The distinction between the not uncovering of evidence that could predicate and the evidence of the factual foundation's absence was the distinction that the legal commentators who examined the memo identified as the distinction that the memo's specific language maintained and that the memo's reception required to be understood. The not uncovering was the conclusion of the review's evidentiary assessment. The evidence of the absence would have required the review to have found the specific evidence that the factual foundation was not present, which was a different finding from the finding that the factual foundation's presence had not been established by the review's examination of the available evidence. The memo said the former, it did not say the latter. The distinction was the distinction between we found no evidence and we found evidence of nothing, and the memo found the former rather than the latter, and the former was the finding of the review's conclusion of its examination rather than the finding of the investigation's establishment of the fact. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Department of Justice's decision not to release further files, despite Pam Bondi's repeated promises that more material would be released, was the decision that had generated the specific variety of institutional frustration that the promise's non-fulfillment generates when the promises have been made publicly and have organized the public expectation that the public expectation generates when it has been organized around the specific content that the promises had implied. Bondi had been the Attorney General who had made the promises, and the promises had been made in the specific context of the political pressure from the MAGA-aligned right that had been demanding the full disclosure of the Epstein files since before Epstein's death, and the promises had been made in the form of the commitments, whose fulfillment the commitment makers' assessment of the political environment had indicated was the appropriate institutional response to the political pressure. The fulfillment had not been as complete as the promises had implied, and the non-fulfillment had generated the commentary of people whose proximity to the investigation's contents had established their basis for the commentary, which was the commentary of the congressional aide who had described what had been seen from the UK names as just the opening chapter, and of the various legal and political observers whose professional positions gave them access to the dimension of the files that the public releases had not made available, and who were communicating their assessment of that dimension in the form of the characterization that a chapter had been opened and that the chapter's continuation was the continuation that the subsequent investigation and the subsequent proceedings would produce. The subsequent investigation was the investigation that the birthday arrest had formalized in British jurisdiction, and the British jurisdiction's investigation was proceeding under the legal framework that the British Misconduct in Public Office charge provided, and the framework's evidentiary requirements were the requirements of the British criminal law rather than the American federal law, and the British criminal law's requirements had been met by the Thames Valley Police's assessment in the form that the birthday arrest had established. The birthday arrest was the establishment of the thresholds meeting in British jurisdiction that the zero cooperation had prevented from being established in American jurisdiction, and the establishment was the outcome of the specific combination of the file's release and the Republic complaint and the Thames Valley Police's assessment and the investigation's conclusion that the assessment had produced. The zero cooperation that Geoffrey Berman had characterized outside Epstein's Manhattan townhouse in January 2020 had been the beginning of the account that the birthday arrest in February 2026 had produced the next chapter of, and the chapters between the beginning and the next had been the chapters of the settlement and the eviction battle, and the title stripping and the file releases, and the photographs, and the Senate Judiciary Committee letter and the FBI memo, and the Mandelson parallel, and the 173 appearances, and the chapters had been producing the picture that the picture required to be produced, which was the picture of the scope and the depth of the private circle, whose public account had been organized around the managed minimum since the Newsnight interview had established the minimum's insufficiency in November 2019. The minimum had been insufficient. The investigation had found it insufficient. The arrest had been the findings' formalization. The cooperation had been zero. The accounting was not. Virginia Giuffre died on the 22nd of May 2025. She was 41 years old. The manner of her death was suicide, and the announcement of the manner came from her family in the form that such announcements come when the family has decided that the honesty about the manner is the thing the person deserves, rather than the managed description that families sometimes apply to deaths of this kind, when the management is judged to serve the person's memory better than the honesty. The family judged the honesty to be the appropriate form, and the honesty was the form that the coverage of her death received, and that the people who had followed her 25-year pursuit of accountability for what had been done to her received in the specific way that the deaths of people who have spent their lives pursuing something they have not yet achieved are received, which was the way of the specific grief of the unfinished. The unfinished was the unfinished of the criminal accountability that the settlement had not provided, and the FBI's closure had not provided, and the 25 years had not produced in the form that the criminal accountability requires to be produced, which is the form of the verdict, rather than the form of the settlement, or the investigation, or the files, or the photographs, or the 173 appearances. She had pursued the verdict across 25 years, and she had not reached the verdict, and she was dead at 41, and the verdict was still the thing that had not been produced when she died, and the not producing of it, across the years of the pursuit, was the dimension of the 25 years that the specific manner of her death required to be held alongside the dimension of what the pursuit had produced, which was the settlement, and the Maxwell conviction, and the files and the photographs, and the birthday arrest. Nobody's Girl was published in October 2025, 5 months after her death, as the posthumous memoir that she had been writing and that the publisher had released, in the form that posthumous memoirs are released when the person who wrote them has died before the publication, and when the writing has been completed, to the point that the publication can proceed in the form that the person intended. The title was the title she had chosen, and the choosing of it was the choosing of a person who had been understanding her own position in the world for long enough to have found the language for it, which was the language of the person who had been nobody's girl, in the specific sense that the operation had produced, which was the sense of the person who had been used by the people who used her, and who had been nobody's, in the sense that she had not been protected, or claimed, or acknowledged by anyone whose protection, or claiming, or acknowledgement would have prevented the using. The memoir contained the account she had been giving across 25 years of testimony and interviews and legal filings, organized in the form of the narrative rather than the form of the legal document, and the narrative form produced the account in the specific way that narratives produce accounts, which was the way of the chronological and the personal and the textured, with the specific detail that the legal document's formal requirements had sometimes required to be organized around the legal categories rather than the human experience. The human experience was the content that the memoir's narrative form was designed to hold, and the holding produced the account of the Palm Beach spa, and the Maxwell approach, and the traveling, and the properties, and the 3 encounters with Andrew, in the specific detail that the narrative allowed, and that the legal document had contained, in the more compressed form of the allegation and the supporting evidence. The specific detail that the memoir added to the public record was the detail of the texture of the experience rather than the architecture of the allegation, which was the detail that established for the reader the specific quality of what the operation had meant to the person who had been inside it, rather than the specific legal elements that the allegation was organized around establishing. The detail was the detail of how it had felt, and what it had looked like from the inside, and what the specific people, and the specific environments, and the specific occasions had been like in the form that the person who had been there and had spent 25 years processing what being there had meant, could now produce in the form of the memoir's freedom from the legal document's constraints. Maxwell's draft statement, found in the Epstein files and released as part of the documentary record that the investigation had assembled, addressed Giuffre in the terms that Epstein's operations management of its accusers had always applied, which were the terms of the discrediting. The statement described Giuffre, whose name was redacted in the released form of the document, but whose identity the statement's specific details established beyond reasonable doubt, as someone who was selling her memoirs to the highest bidder and whose claims were the claims of the person seeking commercial benefit from the allegations, rather than the claims of the person whose experience the allegations described. The statement also noted that Maxwell had first met Giuffre when she was working as a masseuse at Mar-a-Lago, and that Epstein had interviewed her for the position of his masseuse, and the noting established the specific facts of the recruitment's initial context, in the specific form that the draft statement was organized around deploying, which was the form of the innocent alternative account of the first encounter, rather than the form of the recruitment mechanism that the subsequent proceedings had established. The draft statement's existence in Epstein's files was itself the piece of the documentary record whose specific significance the coverage of the files had not always adequately examined, because the draft statement was the draft of a document that had been prepared in response to the approaching coverage of Giuffre's allegations and that had been found in Epstein's possession in the form of the draft, which established that the document had been prepared in the context of the coordination between Epstein and Maxwell in the management of the allegations that the 2011 email exchange between Epstein, Maxwell, and the Duke had been the other documentary evidence of. The three-way coordination of the management of Giuffre's allegations was the coordination that the 3 parties' correspondence had established. Epstein asking Maxwell's lawyers to send a letter, Maxwell preparing the draft statement, and the Duke asking that every statement or legal letter state clearly that he was not involved. The three-way coordination was the specific dimension of the file's documentary record that the public account of the Epstein scandal had least adequately examined, because the public account had been organized around the two-party dynamic of the famous person and the accuser, rather than the three-party coordination of the famous person and the accused's associates in the management of the accuser's claims. The three-party coordination was the documentation of something more specific than the social friendship, which was the operational coordination of people who were managing a shared liability rather than simply the friends who had gathered at each other's properties and attended each other's dinner parties. The shared liabilities management had been the management that the three-way email exchange of March 2011 had documented in the form of the real-time coordination of the message, and the draft statement had documented in the form of the prepared written response, and the birthday arrest had produced the institutional examination of, in the form of the misconduct in public office charge, that the investigation had determined was the appropriate charge for the conduct the files had documented. The operational coordination of the management of the shared liability was the dimension of the private circle's operation that the social account of the circle had not contained, and that the files had added to the public record in the form of the documentary evidence that the investigation had assembled. Steve Scully's account, preserved in the FBI document that the files had released, was the witness account that the investigation had found among the materials it had examined, and that the files release had made available in the form of the FBI report that contained it. Scully had worked for Epstein in the early 2000s, and his account of what he had seen on Epstein's Island was the account that this account's second part had established in the specific terms that the FBI report preserved, which were the terms of the recalled observation of Andrew on the island grinding against some young girl in the pool. The account was the witness account of the person who had been present and who had described what he had seen to the investigators who had interviewed him, and the account's preservation in the FBI report, and the report's presence in the released files, was the preservation of the observation in the documentary form that the investigation had produced. The prosecution memo that the DOJ released as part of the file releases had noted that the authorities had some concerns about Giuffre's reliability, which was the notation of the specific dimension of the evidentiary assessment that the assessment's conclusion had been organized around, because the evidentiary assessment of a witness's reliability is the assessment that the criminal proceeding requires before the witness's account can be presented in the form that the criminal proceedings standards demand. The concerns about the reliability were the concerns that the defense of the people the witness had accused had always identified as the basis for the challenge to the witness's account, and the challenges had been the challenges that the settlement and the FBI closure had each addressed in the specific way that the settlement and the closure addressed things, which was the way of the resolved, without the verdict, that the challenges required the verdict to address. The resolved without the verdict was the dimension of Giuffre's 25-year pursuit that the posthumous memoir had been organized around providing the account of, in the specific form of the person who had pursued the verdict and had not reached it, and who had produced in the memoir the account of the pursuit and the experience and the cost of the pursuit that the verdict would have produced in the form of the judgment, but that the memoir was producing in the form of the narrative that the judgment's absence required the narrative to provide. The narrative's provision of the account in the absence of the verdict was the provision that the memoir made, and the making was the making of someone who had understood that the verdict's absence was the condition the memoir was required to address, and who had addressed it in the form of the narrative that the absence required. Her brother Sky Roberts was in California on the 19th of February, 2026, when the news arrived from Norfolk. He was interviewed by the people who called him for the response that the interviews with the family of the person whose 25 years of pursuit had contributed to the arrest of the person whose arrest had occurred required the interview to produce, and his response was the response of someone for whom the surreal and the proud and the first step were the three things the moment had been, and the three things were the three things that the moment's specific quality, the moment of the first formal institutional step toward the accountability that the 25 years had been organized around producing, had generated in the person who was carrying the dimension of the pursuit that her death had required him to carry. The first step was his characterization, and the first step was the characterization that the birthday arrest warranted, if the characterization was the characterization of the formal institutional process, rather than the characterization of the accountability that the formal institutional process was pursuing. Because the birthday arrest was the initiation of the process rather than the conclusion of it, and the conclusion of the process was the verdict, or the charge, or the determination that the investigation would produce in the form of the outcome that the investigation's continuation was directed toward producing. The first step had been taken. The subsequent steps were the steps that the investigation was taking, and the investigation was taking them in the specific pace that the British criminal investigation takes, when the investigation is the investigation of an offence whose complexity and whose documentary record and whose international dimension require the investigation's attention to be organized across the multiple dimensions that the complexity and the documentary record and the international dimension produce. She had not lived to see the first step. She had died in May 2025. The first step had been taken in February 2026, 9 months after her death, and the 9 months was the specific interval between the death of the person whose 25 years of not stopping had contributed to the step's availability, and the taking of the step whose availability the 25 years had contributed to producing. The interval was the interval that the file's releases, and the Republic complaint, and the Thames Valley Police's assessment, and the investigation's conclusion had produced across the 9 months, and the 9 months had produced the first step. The first step was what her brother had called it. The first step was the accurate characterization of the birthday arrest in the terms of the pursuit rather than the terms of the institutional process, and the terms of the pursuit were the terms that Virginia Giuffre had organized her life around across 25 years of the pursuing, and the pursuing had produced the first step, and the first step had been taken 9 months after the pursuing had stopped, because the person doing the pursuing had died. The memoir was in print, the pursuit was in the files were what remained of the 25 years. The birthday arrest was what the 25 years had contributed to producing. The verdict was the thing that the 25 years had not produced, and that the investigation was pursuing, and that the pursuit's outcome would determine in the form that the investigation's conclusion would produce, and the conclusion had not been produced at the point of this account's assembly. Nobody's girl had spent 25 years making herself somebody's case. The case was open. The 23,000 documents that the House Oversight Committee had received from the Epstein estate, and that the Department of Justice had been releasing in tranches across 2025 and 2026, were not organized around the British dimension of the operations network, because the investigation that had produced the documents had been organized around the American federal law's categories of the offense, rather than around the geography of the network's membership, and the geography of the network's membership was international, in the specific sense that a network built around the credential of the Royal Connection and the hospitality of the Caribbean island and the Manhattan townhouse and the Palm Beach estate would be international, because the credential and the hospitality and the properties operated as attractors for the international rather than the specifically national, and the people who were attracted by the attractors were the people whose positions in their respective institutional worlds made the attractors' specific offerings valuable to them. The British dimension was nonetheless the dimension that the British press's coverage of the files organized itself around most extensively, because the British press's coverage of the Epstein scandal had always been organized around the British dimension that the Giuffre allegations against Andrew had established as the primary British connection, and the files extension of the documentary record, beyond the Giuffre allegations, and the Newsnight interview, and the settlement had extended the British dimension of the coverage in the directions that the extension produced, which were the directions of the trade envoy emails, and the Mandelson parallel, and the Sandringham photograph, and the Buckingham Palace dinner invitation, and the 173 appearances. But the 173 appearances were not the only British appearances in the 23,000 documents, and the 2 arrests were not the only British institutional connections that the files had documented, and the extent of the British dimension beyond the 2 arrested men was the dimension that the British press's coverage had examined with variable thoroughness in the weeks and months of the releases. Because the variable thoroughness was the thoroughness of a press whose legal exposure when naming living individuals in connection with a sex trafficking investigation, without the specific legal foundation that the naming required, was the exposure that the British defamation law's specific character imposed on the naming, and that had organized the coverage of the names below the arrested two around the managed vocabulary of the reported name, and the denied allegation, and the no wrongdoing found, rather than the vocabulary of the established connection. The Epstein contact database, which had been the subject of speculation across the years since Epstein's death, and whose existence had been the existence of the document that the people who were demanding the file's release had identified as the document they most wanted to see, had appeared in the released files in a form that the file's reception had treated as one of the central documents of the release. The database was the database of Epstein's contacts, assembled across the decades of the network's operation in the form of the names and the numbers and the addresses that a man of Epstein's organizational thoroughness would have assembled when the management of the network he was running required the organizational thoroughness of the person who understood that the network's operation depended on the maintenance of the contacts. The British names in the database were the British names of the people who had been in Epstein's contact database for the range of reasons that people end up in a wealthy and socially prominent man's contact database, which were the reasons of the dinner party invitation and the charity connection and the professional relationship and the social introduction and the specific variety of the one-time meeting that produces the exchange of details and the entry into the database that the exchange of details generates. Being in the contact database was not the evidence of the participation in the operation that the operation's most serious criminal dimensions involved, and the distinction between being in the contact database and participating in the operation had been the distinction that the responsible coverage of the database's British names had organized its reporting around, because the responsible coverage understood that the distinction was the distinction between the social connection and the criminal involvement, and that the two were not the same thing, and that treating them as the same thing was the treatment that the British defamation law's specific character would address in the form that the courts make available to people who have been treated as participants in a criminal operation on the basis of their presence in a contact database. The responsible coverage's management of the distinction had not prevented the less responsible coverage from treating the distinction in the way that the less responsible coverage treats the distinctions whose management is more carefully observed by the coverage whose legal exposure is more carefully managed, which was the way of the implication and the proximity and the context of and the was reportedly and the was named in the files, all of which were the vocabulary of the coverage that was communicating the connection without establishing it in the form that the establishing would require. The vocabulary of the implication had produced in the public understanding of the British dimension of the files a picture whose specific content the responsible coverage had not established, and that the irresponsible coverage had communicated through the vocabulary of the implication. And the picture was the picture of a broader British institutional engagement with the Epstein network than the two arrested men had established. The picture's accuracy, in the specific sense of the accuracy that the responsible coverage requires to be established before the coverage can treat the picture as the picture rather than as the implication, was not established at the point of this account's assembly in the form that the establishment requires, because the establishment requires either the documentary evidence that the files had provided for the two arrested men, or the charging decision that the investigation would produce if the investigation concluded that the evidence met the threshold, and neither had been produced for the British names in the database who had not been arrested and whose presence in the database was the presence of their names in the list of the people a wealthy and socially prominent man had in his contact database. The UK government's own file release, announced in May 2026, after the sustained political pressure that the birthday arrest and the Mandelson parallel had generated in the House of Commons, and the specific calls from opposition members and from the cross-party group of MPs who had identified the Andrew Mandelson parallel as the evidence that the British government's own engagement with the files was the engagement that the British public interest required, produced the documents that the government had determined were the documents that could be released without compromising the ongoing investigations that the birthday arrest had initiated and that the government had been managing around since the birthday arrest's formalization of the investigation. The government's file release was the release of a smaller body of material than the American releases had produced, because the British government's management of the material was organized around the British investigation's requirements in a way that the American government's releases had been organized around different considerations, and the different considerations had produced the different volume and the different character of the British release. The British release was primarily the release of the trade envoy documents that the BBC had already been reporting on and that the Republic complaint had been organized around, supplemented by the Foreign Office internal assessments of the trade envoy role's operation that the government's review of the appointment had produced, and that the five-part finding of the May 2026 Time magazine account had organized into the specific revelations that the Time account had characterized as the 5 things we learned from the UK government's release. The 5 things included the confirmation that the trade envoy role had not been vetted with the thoroughness that the role's confidentiality requirements demanded, which was the confirmation that the late Queen's wish had been the organizing principle of the appointment rather than the security assessment that the appointment's sensitivity required. They included the confirmation that the specific business associates who had accompanied Andrew on the October 2010 Asia trips were associates linked to Epstein, which was the confirmation that the travel that had produced the confidential reports that had been forwarded to Epstein's inbox 5 minutes after being received had been travel in which Epstein's associates had been present as the business contacts, whose presence the trade envoy's function of facilitating the introductions and the meetings had generated. They included the confirmation that the Foreign Office had been aware of concerns about the trade envoy's conduct in the years before the appointment was terminated, and had managed those concerns through the channels of the internal assessment, rather than the public accountability that the concern's nature had warranted. The wider establishment dimension was the dimension that the Foreign Office's internal assessments had documented in the specific form of the institution's own examination of the consequences of the appointment's conduct, and the examination had produced the assessments that had been filed and managed within the institution, rather than communicated to the public, whose trade representative was conducting the conduct that the assessments were examining. The managed internal examination was the management of the institution's own record of its knowledge of the conduct, and the management was the management of the institution that had decided that the internal examination was the appropriate response to the concerns rather than the public accountability, and the decision was the decision that the government's file release had now established as the decision that the institution had made and that the files were now producing the public examination of. The parliamentary dimension of the British establishment's engagement with the Epstein files was the dimension that the House of Commons had been producing across the weeks and months of the file releases, in the form of the questions and the debates, and the specific calls for further disclosure, that the members who had identified the British dimension's extent as exceeding what the public releases had established were producing through the mechanisms that the parliamentary process provides. The Keir Starmer government had been managing the parliamentary pressure with the combination of the investigation's requirements and the political management that the management of a parliamentary crisis of this specific character requires, when the crisis involves a former member of the royal family and a former senior member of the same political party as the sitting Prime Minister, and the management had been the management of the government that had concluded that the law must take its course was the appropriate formulation, and that the formulation's application to both the royal family's former member and the Labour Party's former senior figure was the application that the political management required to be consistent across both. The consistency was the consistency of the formulation rather than the consistency of the treatment, because the treatment of the two was the treatment that the different institutional relationships to the different individuals had produced. Charles had issued the 4 words and had moved to distance the institution from Andrew in the specific ways that the monarchy's management of the crisis had taken, and Starmer had fired Mandelson from the ambassadorship and had urged the House of Lords' resignation and had issued the law must take its course after the arrest, and the different specific steps had been organized around the different institutional relationships while maintaining the identical formulation that established the government's and the monarchy's common position on the legal process's appropriate primacy. The British dimension of the files was the dimension that the public release and the government release and the parliamentary process and the two investigations had been establishing across the months between the January 2026 initial release and the point of this account's assembly, and the establishing had produced the picture whose dimensions exceeded the picture that the public account of Andrews Epstein relationship had contained before the files had begun their assembly of the fuller picture. The fuller picture's dimensions were the dimensions of the trade envoy emails and the Sandringham photograph and the Buckingham Palace dinner invitation and the Mandelson parallel and the wider establishment's documented engagement with the network's operation. And the dimensions were still being established by the investigation's continuation and the file's remaining unreleased portions, and the ongoing political and parliamentary examination of what the British dimension of the most extensively documented sex trafficking operation in American federal investigation history had actually contained. What it had contained was more than the public account had established. The establishing of the more was the work of the investigation and the files and the parliamentary process and the press coverage that the establishing required, and the work was continuing. The birthday arrest produced, in the specific form of the police statement that accompanied it, the description of what had been established sufficiently to justify the arrest, and what had been established sufficiently to justify the arrest was described in the police statement's vocabulary of the suspected, which was the vocabulary that the British criminal laws process requires the police to use when the arrest is the arrest of suspicion, rather than the arrest of the charged. The Thames Valley Police had arrested Andrew Mountbatten Windsor on suspicion of misconduct in public office. The suspicion was the institutional conclusion that the review of the Republic complaint and the examination of the Epstein files' content had produced in the form of the assessment that the threshold had been met, and the threshold's meeting was the assessment that the arrest required to precede it, and that the arrest formalized in the specific institutional form of the birthday morning and the 6 unmarked vehicles at Wood Farm. What the arrest established was not the same as what the charge would establish, and the charge was not the same as what the conviction would establish, and the distinction between the established and the charged and the convicted was the distinction that the British criminal process required to be maintained across the stages of the process's progression, from the arrest, through the investigation, through the charging decision, through the trial, and to the verdict. Each stage established a different category of the established, and the category that the arrest established was the category of the suspected, which was the category of the person about whom the law enforcement institution had concluded that the available evidence met the threshold for the formal investigation that the arrest initiated. The specific conduct that the available evidence had established as the suspected conduct was the conduct of the trade envoy emails. This was the conduct that the Republic complaint had identified, that the Thames Valley Police had assessed, and that the assessment had concluded met the threshold for the misconduct in public office charge that the birthday arrest had been executed on. The trade envoy emails were the specific documentary evidence that the thresholds meeting required, because the misconduct in public office charge in British criminal law requires the establishment of the specific elements that the charge addresses, which were the elements of the public office, the misconduct in the exercise of that office, and the conduct being such that it amounts to an abuse of the public's trust in the office holder. The public office was the trade envoy role. The misconduct in the exercise of the role was the sharing of the confidential commercial intelligence with an unauthorized private individual. The conduct amounting to an abuse of the public's trust was the conduct of a government representative sharing with a convicted sex offender the confidential information that the government representative's role had given him access to, and that the role's terms required him to protect. The 3 elements of the charge were the 3 things that the trade envoy emails had established in the documentary form that the email's content provided. And the documentary establishment of all 3 elements was the establishment that the threshold required and that the arrest had followed. What the charge had not established, and what the investigation was proceeding to determine whether the evidence would establish, was the wider scope of the conduct beyond the specific emails that the Republic complaint had organized the investigation around. The wider scope was the scope that the Congressional Aid's opening chapter characterization had described, and the opening chapter was the chapter of the documented and the established, rather than the chapter of the investigated and the potential. The subsequent chapters were the chapters of the investigation's examination of the evidence that the file's content had established as the evidence requiring examination, and the examination was proceeding in the specific form that the British criminal investigation takes when the investigation is examining the evidence of a complex offence across a documentary record of the scale and the international dimension that the Epstein file's content provided. The specific questions that the investigation was examining, assembled from the publicly available accounts of the investigation's progress and the specific dimensions of the documentary record that the investigation had been examining, were the questions that the established evidence's gaps had identified as the questions that the established evidence did not answer, and that the investigation's examination of the wider record was organized around addressing. The first of these questions was the question of what Epstein had done with the confidential information that the trade envoy emails had established he had received, because the trade envoy emails established the receiving, but not the using, and the using was the dimension of the conduct whose establishment would complete the picture of the specific harm that the sharing had produced beyond the sharing itself. The harm of the sharing was the harm that the misconduct in public office charge addressed in the specific form of the abuse of the public trust, which was the harm that the office holder's betrayal of the trust produces regardless of what the betrayed information was subsequently used for, because the betrayal of the trust is the harm rather than the betrayal's consequences being required to be the harm before the charge can be established. But the consequences were the dimension of the investigation's examination that the investigation had determined was relevant to the full picture of the conduct's scope, and the consequences were the consequences that the question of what Epstein had done with the confidential information about Singapore and Vietnam and Shenzhen and Hong Kong and the Helmand Province reconstruction was organized around answering. Epstein had financial interests in multiple international markets. His operation had included the management of the financial interests of the world's wealthiest individuals, and the management had been organized around the access to the specific intelligence about the specific markets in which the managed interests were invested, that the access to the people who could provide the intelligence produced. The trade envoy's confidential commercial intelligence about 4 of the most commercially significant territories in the Asia-Pacific region, and the confidential brief on the investment opportunities in a reconstruction project in a British military theatre were the categories of the intelligence whose utility to a financial operator with Epstein's specific interests was the utility that the investigation was examining in the dimension of the consequences of the sharing. The second question was the question of whether other British officials had been involved in the sharing of confidential government information with Epstein or with the people in the Epstein network, because the Mandelson parallel had established that the documented connection between the Epstein network and the confidential government information had not been limited to the single case of the trade envoy emails, but had extended to the second case of the business secretary's alleged sharing of the internal government report and the lobbying commitment, and the second case had established the pattern that the pattern's extension might be investigated in the direction of the third case and the fourth case if the evidence supported the extension. The evidence that supported or did not support the extension was the evidence that the investigation was examining, and the examination had not produced, at the point of this account's assembly, the publicly available conclusion about whether the extension was supported. The publicly available conclusion was the conclusion that the 2 arrested men were the 2 men whose conduct the investigation had determined met the threshold, and the determination had been the determination of the available evidence's assessment, rather than the exhaustive examination of all the possible conduct that the network's British dimension might have involved, and the exhaustive examination was the examination that the investigation's continuation was organized around conducting. The third question was the question of the photographs, specifically the photographs of the 3 kneeling images and the Sandringham lying across laps image, and the specific question was the question of what the photographs established beyond what the photographs established, which was the question of whether the investigation's examination of the photographs, in the context of the fuller documentary record, could produce the specific additional evidence that the photographs themselves did not contain. The photographs established the presence. The fuller documentary record contained the travel logs and the calendars and the correspondence that could establish the specific occasions on which the presence had occurred, and the specific participants, whose presence at the same occasions the fuller documentary record might document in forms that the photographs did not contain. The fourth question was the question of the December 2009 Paris Bank email, which was the email that Andrew had sent to Epstein, describing the interesting American family bank he had spent the weekend with, and the gap in their geographic coverage, and the potential for help in the Middle East. The Paris Bank email had been reported in the coverage of the files as the email that established a specific commercial transactions introduction through the Epstein connection, and the introduction of a commercial transaction through the Epstein connection was the dimension of the conduct whose examination, in the context of the trade envoy role's requirements, and the specific nature of the introduced transaction, was the examination that the investigation had determined was relevant to the fuller picture of the conduct's scope. The released under investigation status that the birthday arrest had produced for Andrew was the status that the British criminal laws process maintained for the person who had been arrested and released pending the investigation's completion, and the status was the status that the Criminal Justice Act 2017 had established as the replacement for the bail system that had produced the problems that the replacement was designed to address. The status maintained Andrew in the specific institutional position of the person who was under investigation but had not been charged, and the not charged was the not charged of the investigation's continuation rather than the not charged of the investigation's conclusion, because the investigation's conclusion would produce either the charging decision or the determination that the evidence was insufficient for the charging decision, and neither had been produced at the point of this account's assembly. The daily life that the released under investigation status produced for Andrew was the daily life that the status's specific institutional character generated, which was the daily life of someone whose freedom of movement was maintained, but whose institutional position was the position of the person under formal investigation by the British police for an offence whose maximum sentence was life imprisonment, whose international travel was the travel of someone whose passport the investigation had not required to be surrendered, but whose profile as the person under investigation for the offence made the travel whose specific destinations and purposes the investigation's management required to be managed. He was living at a cottage on the Sandringham estate. He had no title. He had no institutional role. He had the investigation. What remains unknown, assembled from the gaps in the established record that the investigation's continuation was organized around addressing, was the dimension of the fuller picture whose assembly required the investigation's completion rather than the investigation's initiation. The initiation had established the suspected. The completion would establish the charged or the uncharged, the sufficient or the insufficient, the verdict or the no verdict, and the form that the completion took would be the form of the investigation's conclusion rather than the form of the account that the investigation's continuation was producing across the ongoing examination of the evidence, whose scope the opening chapter's characterization had described as the scope that exceeded what the opening chapter had contained. The opening chapter had contained the birthday arrest. The subsequent chapters were the investigation. The investigation was continuing. Charles III had been preparing for the birthday arrest before the birthday arrest occurred, in the specific sense that the months between the January 2026 file releases and the February 2026 arrest had been the months in which the palace's communications operation had been managing the approaching inevitability of the institutional response that the file's content had made increasingly clear was the response that would be required. The managing of the approaching inevitability was the managing of the institution that understands that the approach of the thing it needs to respond to is the period in which the response needs to be designed, because the design of the response in the period of the approach is the design that the response's quality requires, rather than the design of the response in the moment of the thing's arrival. When the design's quality is constrained by the moment's pressure, and the moment's pressure is the pressure that the pre-designed response is organized to absorb, rather than to improvise against. The pre-designed response was the 4 words, "The law must take its course." The design of 4 words is the design of someone who has understood that the response's function is the function of the institutional separation rather than the function of the institutional engagement, and that the institutional separation is achieved most efficiently by the minimum language that achieves it. because the minimum language that achieves the separation is the language that leaves the smallest available surface for the follow-up question, and the follow-up question is the question that the institutional response to a family member's arrest needs to be most carefully designed to prevent from requiring an answer. The law must take its course was the response that the follow-up question found most difficult to productively engage with, because the follow-up question's most natural direction was the direction of the institution's support for or condemnation of the arrested family member, and the law must take its course was the response that occupied the specific position between the support and the condemnation that made the follow-up question's direction unavailable. The response was issued within hours of the arrest. The speed was the speed that the pre-design made possible because the pre-design had been in place before the arrest, and the arrest had triggered the release of the pre-designed response rather than the design of the response in the moment. The speed was also the speed that the institutional separation required, because the separation's function was the function of the immediate establishment of the institution's distance from the arrested individual, and the immediate establishment required the immediate response, and the immediate response was the response that the pre-design had made available. The communications operation had been managing the approach to the arrest across the months of the file releases in several specific forms whose combination had constituted the palace's pre-arrest management of the crisis. The October 2025 title stripping had been the most significant of these, because the title stripping was the irreversible institutional action whose completion before the arrest had established that the institution had already taken the most significant available action before the arrest required the response to a new development, and the pre-completion of the most significant available action was the design of the response that made the arrest's arrival a development that required the minimum response rather than the maximum one. The minimum response was the 4 words. The maximum response would have been the response that the arrest of a sitting working royal would have required, which was the response to the arrest of a person whose institutional position the institution had not already addressed, and the maximum response would have required the institution to address the institutional position in the moment of the arrest's arrival, rather than in the preceding months of the approach's management. The pre-completion of the title stripping had converted the maximum responses requirement into the minimum responses availability, and the minimum responses availability was the design achievement that the months of the approach's management had been working toward. The Starmer government's management of the crisis was organized around the specific challenge of the government that has a former senior member of its party arrested for the same offense as the former member of the royal family who was arrested 4 days earlier. Because the challenge is the challenge of the institution that must communicate the institutional separation from both people simultaneously while maintaining the appearance of the institutional position that both separations require, which is the position of the law must take its course, rather than the position of the government's assessment of the individual's conduct. The identical formulation from both the monarchy and the government was not the coincidence of 2 institutions reaching the same formulation independently. It was the coordination of 2 institutions that had understood that the identical formulation was the appropriate formulation, and that the coordination of its deployment was the deployment that the management of the simultaneous crisis required. Starmer had fired Mandelson from the ambassadorial role before the arrest, and the firing had been the firing that the January and February 2026 file releases had made necessary in the specific terms of the government's institutional position on the appropriateness of the United Kingdom's most senior diplomatic representative in Washington being the person who was the subject of the developing file revelations about the relationship with Epstein. The firing had been managed in the form of the mutual agreement, which was the form that the firings of senior public figures who are being managed out of positions they have occupied with distinction are managed when the management requires the appearance of the voluntary rather than the involuntary to be maintained, and the appearance had been maintained in the form of the departure statement that Mandelson had issued, acknowledging the decision, and the government's statement that acknowledged the decision in the specific terms of the regret that the departure required. The House of Lords' resignation that had followed the ambassadorial firing was the resignation that Starmer had urged rather than required, because requiring the resignation of a life peer from the House of Lords was not within the government's institutional capacity, in the specific sense that the House of Lords Act and the constitutional arrangements governing membership of the upper chamber did not provide the mechanism for the compelled resignation that the political pressure was organized around producing through the urged, rather than the compelled form. The urging had produced the resignation before the arrest, and the resignation before the arrest had produced the specific institutional sequence of the departures, whose completion before the arrest had established that the institution of the Labour Party had already taken the significant available actions before the arrest required the response to the new development. The parliamentary response had been the response of the weeks following the birthday arrest, in the specific form of the questions and the debates and the urgent questions and the opposition days and the select committee hearings that the parliamentary calendar had produced as the mechanisms through which the legislature addressed the arrival of the situation that the executive's management of the files and the investigations had been producing. The questions had been organized around the specific dimensions of the situation that the parliamentary process's different members had identified as the dimensions most requiring the parliamentary examination, which were the dimensions of the vetting failure of the trade envoy appointment, the Foreign Office's internal management of the concerns about the trade envoy's conduct, the government's own file release and its completeness, the investigation's scope and the resources it had been given, and the government's communications with the American investigation and the American file releases about the British dimension of the network's operation. The government's responses to the parliamentary questions had been the responses organized around the investigation's requirements, which were the requirements of the ongoing investigation that constrained the government's responses in the direction of the minimum that the investigation's requirements permitted, rather than the maximum that the Parliament's questions were organized around producing. The investigation was ongoing. The answers that the Parliament was seeking were the answers that the investigation was examining. The examination's requirements constrained the responses. The responses constrained the examination's public dimension. The examination's public dimension was the examination that the Parliament was attempting to produce and that the government's responses were managing in the direction of the examination's requirements, rather than the direction of the Parliament's production of the public examination. The public's understanding of the situation, assembled from the polling and the commentary and the coverage that the weeks and months following the birthday arrest had generated, was the public understanding of a situation whose dimensions the file releases and the birthday arrest and the Mandelson parallel had established as the dimensions that exceeded the public understanding of the Andrew Epstein relationship that the Newsnight interview and the settlement and the stepping back had produced across the preceding years. The preceding year's public understanding had been the understanding of the disgraced royal whose association with a convicted sex offender had required the stepping back and the title stripping and the institutional management that those years had produced. The birthday arrest and the Mandelson parallel had extended the public understanding into the dimension of the institutional conduct, the specific conduct of the public official using the public office's access in the direction of the private benefit, and the extension had produced in the public understanding the specific additional element of the institutional betrayal rather than the personal embarrassment. The institutional betrayal was the element that the misconduct in public office charge addressed in the specific form of the criminal law, and the institutional betrayal was the element that the public understanding of the years before the birthday arrest had not contained in the form that the birthday arrest had added. Because the years before the birthday arrest had organized the public understanding around the personal embarrassment of the association with a convicted sex offender rather than around the institutional betrayal of the government role's confidentiality requirements. The birthday arrest had added the institutional betrayal to the public understanding in the form of the charge that the arrest had formalized, and the addition had produced in the public understanding the specific additional dimension that the institutional betrayal produced in the understanding of the conduct, which was the dimension of the public trust and what had been done with it, rather than the dimension of the personal association and what it had reflected about the personal judgment. The Republican movement's utilization of the institutional betrayal dimension was the utilization that the movement had been developing since the file releases had made the institutional betrayal dimension available to the movement's argument, and the argument was the argument that the birthday arrest had provided the most significant single contribution to, since the Newsnight interview had provided the previous, most significant single contribution. The contribution of the birthday arrest to the Republican argument was the contribution of the specific evidence that the institution's management of one of its members had produced the specific outcome of the arrest on the charge of the institutional betrayal, rather than the specific outcome of the institution's management of the situation through the institutional channels that the institution's management had always applied. The Republican argument was the argument that the institution's management had failed to prevent the institutional betrayal and had accommodated the institutional betrayal across the years of the management, and the birthday arrest was the evidence of the failure rather than the evidence of the success. The institutional responses had been adequate to the minimum requirements of the management and had not been adequate to the requirements of the fuller accountability that the situation had warranted, and the distinction between the minimum management and the fuller accountability was the distinction that the institutional responses had produced in the form of the 4 words and the firings and the title strippings and the parliamentary question management, and the distinction was the distinction that the Republican movement's argument and the parliamentary opposition's questions and the investigative journalism's continued examination of the files were organized around maintaining in the public understanding. The maintaining of the distinction was the maintaining of the question that the institutional responses had produced the answers to in the minimum form, and that the fuller accountability required to be answered in the fuller form that the investigation's completion would produce or not produce, depending on the investigation's outcome. The investigation was continuing, the institutions were managing, the management was the minimum, the accountability was the question. The picture that this account has been assembling across its 10 preceding parts is the picture that the public version of the Andrew Epstein relationship had not contained, and the not containing was the not containing of the specific dimensions that the file releases had added to the public version in the form that the documentary evidence provides, when the documentary evidence is the evidence of the thing rather than the allegation of it. The public version had been the version of the disgraced royal whose association with a convicted sex offender had been managed through the institutional channels of the stepping back and the title stripping and the settlement and the Pizza Express alibi and the sweating claim and the Newsnight interview, and the management had been the management of the personal embarrassment rather than the management of the institutional betrayal, and the institutional betrayal was the dimension that the files had added to the public version in the form of the trade envoy emails and the Christmas Eve Helmand brief and the 5-minute interval between Amit Patel's send and Andrew's forward. The institutional betrayal was the heart of what the public had not learned, and the heart was the heart of the private circle's British dimension that the public version had organized itself around, not examining, because the public version had been organized around the social dimension of the friendship rather than the operational dimension of what the friendship was providing and what the friendship was receiving. The social dimension was the dimension of the party and the island and the nightclub and the Central Park walk and the photographs, and the social dimension was the dimension that the Newsnight interview had been organized around addressing, with the Pizza Express alibi and the sweating claim serving as the specific responses to the specific social occasions that the interview had identified as the occasions requiring the specific responses. The operational dimension was the dimension of the trade envoy emails and the Buckingham Palace dinner invitation and the Sandringham photograph and the Mandelson parallel, and the operational dimension was the dimension that the interview had not been organized around addressing because the interview had not been aware that the operational dimension was the dimension that the documentary record was assembling, because the documentary record was in the files, and the files had not yet been released. The network's British heart was the specific dimension of the Epstein operation that the 23,000 documents had been establishing in the form of the cumulative record that the individual documents contributed to, and the cumulative records establishment of the British heart was the establishment that the individual documents had not separately produced, but that the assembled documents produced in the form of the pattern, whose visibility required the assembly rather than the individual examination. The pattern was the pattern of the British institutional access being provided to the Epstein network through the specific mechanism of the royal connection, and the governmental connection that the network's two most prominent British participants had represented. And the two connections had been the connections that had provided the network with the specific variety of the British institutional legitimacy that the network's social Ponzi mechanism required, in the form of the credential that the presence of the most senior available British figures at the network's occasions and in the network's correspondence had provided. The royal connection had provided the social Ponzi's most valuable British credential, which was the credential of the royal presence at the occasions, and the royal name in the correspondence, and the royal properties in the photographs. And the credential had been the credential that the social Ponzi's logic required to be the most significant available credential at each stage of the network's expansion, and the royal presence had been the most significant available British credential in the network's British dimension, because the British social hierarchy's organization around the monarchy produced the royal presence as the credential that exceeded every other available British social credential in the institutional hierarchy that the British social world maintained. The governmental connection had provided the operational dimension's most valuable British content, which was the confidential commercial intelligence that the trade envoy role's access had generated, and that the 5-minute forward, and the Christmas Eve Helmand brief, and the October 2010 Asia trip itinerary had transmitted to the network's primary node. And the intelligence was the intelligence that a man managing vast financial interests across the territories that the trade envoy role was visiting would have found valuable in the specific form that the confidential commercial intelligence provides for the financial operator, whose interests are organized around the early knowledge of the commercial opportunities that the trade envoy's assessment of those territories had been produced to identify. The two connections had been operating simultaneously rather than sequentially, which was the specific quality of the British dimension that the public version had least adequately captured, because the public version had been organized around the social connection as the primary connection, and had treated the operational connection as the secondary dimension of the social connection's consequence, rather than as the primary dimension of the network's British utility. The files had established the two connections as the simultaneous primary dimensions of the British relationship, rather than the social as the primary and the operational as the secondary, because the documentary evidence of the operational connection was the documentary evidence of the emails, rather than the secondary inference from the social connection's existence. Peter Mandelson's arrest had been the event that most precisely established the two connections as the simultaneous primaries, because Mandelson's specific position in the network was the position of the governmental connection without the royal connection, and the governmental connection without the royal connection had produced the same charge as the royal connection without the governmental connection's primacy, and the identity of the charge across the two different specific positions in the network was the identity that established the governmental connection as the primary rather than the secondary dimension of the British heart. The governmental connection's primacy was the primacy that the network's utility analysis required to be understood in the specific terms of what Epstein's operation was building toward with the British dimension of the network, because the operation's utility analysis was the analysis of what the operation was using the network's various connections to produce, and the operation had been using the British connections to produce the specific combination of the social legitimacy and the governmental intelligence that the social Ponzi's logic required at the British stage of the expansion, and that the two connections had been providing simultaneously. The social legitimacy was the royal connections provision, and the governmental intelligence was the governmental connections provision, and the two provisions together constituted the British heart of the network's operation in the form that the assembled documentary record had now established. The assembled documentary record had established the British heart in the form of the cumulative evidence that the 173 appearances and the trade envoy emails and the Sandringham photograph and the Buckingham Palace dinner invitation and the Mandelson parallel and the J.P. Morgan risk assessment and the FBI's April 2020 letter and the Balmoral email and the Peru email and the Christmas Eve Helmand brief and the 5-minute forward had collectively produced. The collective production was the production of the assembled record rather than the production of the individual document, and the assembled record's production of the picture was the production that the public version had not contained because the public version had been organized around the individual document rather than the assembled record, and the individual documents had been the documents that the public version's management had permitted to be available, rather than the assembled record that the file's release had now made available. What the assembled record had established about the darker dimension of the private circle that the account's title had proposed was the establishment of the specific darker dimension that the private circle's public account had organized itself around not examining, which was the darker dimension of the governmental connection and the institutional betrayal and the operational utility that the friendship had been providing, rather than the social dimension of the friendship's personal embarrassment. The darker dimension was darker not in the sense of the moral darkness of the personal association with a convicted sex offender, which was the darkness that the public version had been organized around, and which was genuine and documented and damaging, but in the sense of the institutional darkness of the governmental official using the governmental role's access in the direction of the convicted sex offender's operational requirements, which was the darkness that the public version had not examined, because the public version had not had access to the documentary evidence of the operational dimension that the files had provided. The institutional darkness was the darkness that the misconduct in public office charge addressed in the specific form of the criminal law's engagement with the specific conduct, and the charge was the charge that the documentary evidence of the operational dimension had produced in the form of the birthday arrest and the released under investigation status and the ongoing investigation, whose continuation was the continuation of the examination of the fuller record, whose scope the opening chapter characterization had described as exceeding what the opening chapter had contained. The opening chapter had contained the birthday arrest. The opening chapter had contained the Mandelson parallel. The opening chapter had contained the trade envoy emails and the 5-minute forward and the Christmas Eve Helmand brief and the Sandringham photograph and the Buckingham Palace dinner invitation and the kneeling photographs and the 173 appearances, and the FBI's April 2020 letter, and the Balmoral email, and the Peru email, and the Zero cooperation, and the Senate Judiciary Committee letter, and the settlement, and the prosecution memo, and the FBI closure, and the 5-part UK government file release, and the parliamentary questions, and the Republican movement's utilization, and the institutional responses of the 4 words, and the firings, and the title strippings. The opening chapter was not a small chapter. It was the chapter that the 25 years of Virginia Giuffre's pursuit, and the years of the file releases, and the Republic complaint, and the Thames Valley Police's assessment, and the investigation's conclusion had produced in the form of the birthday arrest, and the birthday arrest was the opening chapter of the formal institutional process rather than the opening chapter of the story. Because the story had been accumulating since the late 1990s, when the Manhattan Introduction had established the connection that the 173 appearances had subsequently documented across the 23,000 documents of the investigation that had been examining the connection's operation across the decades of its accumulation. The subsequent chapters were the chapters that the investigation's continuation and the parliamentary examination and the government's file release and the ongoing journalism of the file's examination were producing in the period following the birthday arrest, and the producing was the producing of the fuller picture whose dimensions the opening chapter had established as exceeding the opening chapter's content, and that the subsequent chapters were being organized around establishing in the fuller form that the fuller content required. The fuller form's establishment was the work in progress of the investigation, and the journalism, and the parliament, and the institutional management at the point of this account's assembly, and the work in progress was producing the fuller picture at the pace that the work's complexity and the investigation's requirements and the international dimension of the documentary record required it to be produced at, which was the pace of the thorough rather than the rapid, and the evidential rather than the speculative, and the established rather than the alleged. The established, at the point of this account's assembly, was what the 10 parts preceding this one had assembled from the available documentary record. The alleged was the fuller picture that the congressional aide's opening chapter characterization had described as the content of the subsequent chapters. The subsequent chapters were being written by the investigation. The investigation was continuing. The account that this account has been building, across 11 parts, is the account that the files built before this account assembled it. Because the files are the primary document, and this account is the secondary one. And the distinction between the primary and the secondary is the distinction between the evidence and the examination of the evidence. And the examination of the evidence is what the account has been conducting across the trade envoy emails, and the Sandringham photograph, and the Buckingham Palace dinner invitation, and the kneeling photographs, and the Mandelson parallel, and the Zero cooperation, and the FBI's April 2020 letter, and the Balmoral email, and the Peru email, and the 173 appearances, and the congressional aides opening chapter, and the birthday arrest, and everything that the birthday arrest formalized in the specific institutional form of the suspected and the investigated and the released under investigation. The examination has produced the picture of a private circle whose darker dimension was darker in the specific sense that this account's title had proposed, which was the sense of the dimension that the public had not learned, rather than the sense of the dimension that the public had not been capable of learning if the public had been given what the files contained. The public had not been given what the files contained because the files had been held in the specific form of the federal investigation's assembled documentary record across the years between Epstein's death and the releases, and the holding had been the institutional management of the evidence, in the form that the investigation's requirements and the classification determinations and the political negotiations that the full release had required had maintained across the years of the holding. The holding had ended with the releases. The releases had ended the holding's maintenance of the public version as the only version. The public version and the file version were now both in the public domain, and the file version was the version that this account has been examining in the specific dimension of the British institutional heart that the file version added to the public version's social dimension. The social dimension had been the dimension of the personal embarrassment, the Randy Andy of the Gordonston years, extended across 4 decades of the party, and the island, and the nightclub, and the Central Park walk, and the Newsnight interview. And the personal embarrassment was genuine and damaging, and had consumed a significant portion of the institutional management capacity of the British monarchy and the British public sphere since 2019, in the form of the management of the coverage, and the stepping back, and the settlement, and the eviction battle, and the title stripping. The institutional dimension had been the dimension that the file releases had added to the personal embarrassment in the form of the trade envoy emails, and the 5-minute forward, and the Christmas Eve Helmand brief, and the Buckingham Palace dinner invitation, and the Mandelson parallel. And the institutional dimension was the dimension that had produced the birthday arrest in the form that the personal embarrassment had not produced, because the personal embarrassment was the management problem, and the institutional dimension was the criminal law problem, and the criminal law problem was the problem that the birthday arrest had formalized. What the criminal law problem's formalization tells about the person at the center of the assembled record is the question that the assembled record requires to be asked, rather than the question that the assembled record can be certain of having answered. Because the assembled record is the record of the investigation's beginning, rather than the record of the investigation's conclusion, and the investigation's conclusion is the conclusion that will determine what the criminal law problem's formalization produces in the form of the verdict, or the no verdict, that the investigation's outcome will generate. The assembled record can tell what the assembled record tells, which is the story of the private circle's darker dimension as the files have established it, and the telling is the telling of a man whose relationship to the specific people and the specific institutions and the specific occasions that the files document was the relationship of someone for whom the door that the name opened was the door, and for whom the opening's consequences were consistently the consequences of the person who encountered whatever was on the other side, rather than the consequences of the person who had chosen what was on the other side. The choosing of what was on the other side is the distinction that the assembled record requires the examination to address, because the choosing is the distinction between the person who encountered the operation inadvertently and the person who was operating within it, with the awareness of what the operation was, and the distinction is the distinction that the criminal law addresses, in the form of the intent and the knowledge that the misconduct in public office charge and the potential further charges require to be established. The assembled record has established the conduct, the intent, and the knowledge are the elements whose establishment the investigation was organized around determining, and the determination had not been produced at the point of this account's assembly. What the assembled record has established, in the form that the assembled record establishes things, is the following. A man who held a government position that gave him access to confidential commercial intelligence shared that intelligence with a convicted sex offender across the period of the Rolls operation. The sharing was documented in the emails whose timestamps established the 5-minute interval between the receipt and the forward, the Christmas Eve timing of the Afghan brief, and the October itinerary of the Asia trips. The sharing produced the birthday arrest on the charge that the sharing constituted the misconduct in public office that the British criminal law addresses. The sharing was not the only documented connection between the government Rolls access and the convicted sex offender, because the Mandelson parallel had established that a second government official had been arrested on the same charge in the same week for the same category of the alleged conduct, and the parallel had established the pattern rather than the isolated incident. The pattern's establishment was the establishment of what the public version had least adequately captured about the private circle's darker dimension, because the public version had been organized around the isolated incident of the individual association with the individual convicted sex offender, and had not been organized around the pattern of the British governmental access being provided to the network through the specific mechanism of the Rolls confidentiality requirements being treated as the secondary consideration to the network's operational requirements. The pattern was what the darker than the public ever learned part of this account's proposition was organized around establishing, and the establishment was the establishment of the 10 parts that had assembled the file's content in the form of the cumulative record, whose pattern the individual examination of the individual documents had not produced. The cumulative record's pattern was the pattern of the relationship that had been operating across the social dimension and the operational dimension simultaneously, and that had been providing the network with the specific combination of the royal social legitimacy and the governmental commercial intelligence that the network's British heart had been built around requiring. The requiring had been established by the J.P. Morgan Risk Assessment's identification of the particularly close relationships and the FBI April 2020 letter's identification of the 2 separate investigations and the file's documentary establishment of the correspondence and the photographs and the 173 appearances that the particularly close relationships had generated across the decades of the network's operation. The network's operation had ended with Epstein's death in August 2019. The file's release had begun the accounting of what the operation had been and what the British heart of the operation had contained. The accounting had produced the birthday arrest and the Mandelson parallel, and the investigations, and the parliamentary examination, and the institutional responses, and the Republican movement's utilization, and the judicial process that the birthday arrest had initiated. The accounting was continuing in the form of the investigation's continuation, and the journalism's examination, and the Parliament's questioning, and the government's file management, and the ongoing release of the material that the ongoing political pressure on the release was producing. Virginia Giuffre had pursued the accounting for 25 years and had died 9 months before the birthday arrest that her pursuit had contributed to making available. The birthday arrest had been the first step that her brother had called it, and that the characterization required to be understood in the terms of the pursuit rather than the terms of the institutional process, because the pursuit had been the thing that the 25 years had been organized around producing, and the first step was the first institutional expression of the pursuit's production, in the form of the formal investigation's initiation. The initiation was not the conclusion was the verdict, or the no verdict, that the investigation's outcome would produce, and the outcome had not been produced at the point of this account's assembly. The institution that had produced Andrew Mountbatten Windsor had also produced the management of him across 4 decades of the management, and the management had produced the costs that Part 10 of the previous account had assembled in the financial register and the reputational register and the human register, and the management had produced the birthday arrest in the form of the outcome that the 40 years of the management had been preventing from being the outcome, and that the files had converted from the prevented into the arrived. The management had been expensive. The prevention had been thorough. The arrived had arrived anyway. What had arrived was not the conclusion, but the beginning of the formal process, whose conclusion the investigation would produce. And the formal process was the process that the files had made available by providing the evidence that the threshold required to be met before the process could begin, and the evidence had met the threshold, and the process had begun on the morning of the 19th of February, 2026, when the 6 unmarked vehicles had arrived at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, and the man inside had been driven to the police station in Aylsham, and the institution that had produced him had issued 4 words from the palace that had once invited his convicted sex offender acquaintance to dinner. The law must take its course. The law was taking its course. The course was the investigation and the evidence and the determination that the investigation would produce. The files had established what the files had established. The investigation was determining what the investigation was determining. The account of what the public had not learned was the account that the 11 parts preceding this one had assembled from the files, and the assembly had produced the picture of the private circle's darker dimension in the form of the documentary evidence rather than the form of the allegation. And the documentary evidence was the evidence of the emails and the photographs and the appearances and the parallel and the connections that the files had contained, and that the investigation had been examining, and that the Parliament had been questioning, and that the institutions had been managing, and that the journalism had been assembling into the account, that this account had been building across its 12 parts. The 12 parts had built what the files built, in the secondary form of the examination, rather than the primary form of the evidence. The evidence was in the files. The files were what remained when the management had ended and the investigation had begun, and the course that the law must take had been formalized in the birthday arrest that the approaching morning had produced. He was 66 years old on the morning. It was his birthday. The files had been building toward it for 23,000 documents across the years since the Manhattan introduction that Ghislaine Maxwell had arranged in the late 1990s, and that had placed a British prince in the social world of a convicted sex offender, and had produced the 173 appearances and the 5-minute forward, and the Christmas Eve Helmand brief, and the Sandringham photograph, and the Buckingham Palace dinner invitation, and the Balmoral email, and the Peru email, and the Kneeling photographs, and the March 2011 emails, and the Mandelson parallel, and the JP Morgan risk assessment, and the FBI April 2020 letter, and the birthday arrest. 23,000 documents, 173 appearances, 4 words from the palace, 1 investigation continuing. The files had built what the files built. The building was not finished. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.